Chapter 16. An appealing promise unfulfilled. As when a hungry man dreams that he is eating, but he awakens and his hunger remains. As when a thirsty man dreams that he is drinking, but he awakens faint, with his thirst unquenched. Isaiah 29:8, New International Version. The discussion that has preceded brings a measure of sadness. Sadness at the picture of something that promised so much, but has fallen far short of that promise. What has happened among Jehovah's Witnesses reminds me of thoughts expressed some decades ago by a member of the British Parliament. The footnote reads, W.J. Brown, who died in 1960. Whether his expressions here quoted are from a speech or treatise, I have been unable to determine. Explaining why his conclusion was that, quote, the only categorization that really matters is that which divides men as between the servants of the Spirit and the prisoners of the organization, he demonstrated the way in which the human spirit develops an idea, and then, with the intent of giving substance to the idea, an organization is formed. As to what so frequently happens, he observed, quote, whether the organization be political, religious, or social is immaterial to my present argument. The point is that the idea having embodied itself in organization, the organization then proceeds gradually to slay the idea which gave it birth. If a religious organization, its message will crystallize into a creed. Before long, the principal concern of the church will be to sustain itself as an organization. To this end, any departure from the creed must be controverted and, if necessary, suppressed as heresy. In a few score or 100 years, what was conceived as a vehicle of new and higher truth has become a prison for the souls of men. The idea having given birth to the organization develops a self-interest which has no connection with and becomes inimical to the idea with which it began. Now, the thing which permits this process of diversion to take place so that the organization comes to stand for the opposite of the idea which originally inspired it, is the tendency of men and women to become prisoners of the organization instead of being servants of the Spirit. The organization becomes less the vehicle of an idea than a channel through which particular interests must be served. The footnote reads, Brown's words echo those expressed earlier by Dan Inge, 1860 to 1954, who said, quote, every institution, even the church, ends up by strangling the ideas it was founded to protect. Quoted in the Good News Unlimited magazine of October 1989, page 10. Human knowledge is a dynamic, expanding thing, both on a personal level and collectively. When beliefs become crystallized in the form of creeds or official teachings to which people are required to conform in order to perpetuate an organization, conflict inevitably results. It produces a dividing line between what the parliamentarian calls servants of the Spirit and prisoners of the organization. The organization now known as Jehovah's Witnesses, from its beginning somewhat over a century ago, gave promise of much that was appealing. It sought to break with creed-bound worship of God, to return to the simplicity of first-century Christianity, free from formalistic ritualism, elitism, clergy-dominated thinking, sectarian dogmatism, and intolerance. Emphasis instead was to be placed on a simple brotherhood, an unbiased attitude toward all sincere persons, whatever their existing denominational affiliation, open discussion, and a determination to let the message of God in the Scriptures be the final arbiter in all conclusions and decisions. In course of time, it declared its goal to provide the means for people in all lands to receive education in those Scriptures and to benefit from the foundation of a faith based solely on the biblical message, not on the traditions of men. It pointed people to a way of life that would be always God-directed and God-blessed, due to putting His Son's kingdom in the first place in their lives. Lives lived in integrity, neighbor love, unstinting devotion to healthful spiritual values. Those were the ideals. The reality is not the same. And as Jesus admonished, we should not judge by the appearance of things, but by the reality. The footnote references John 7:24 PME. It is not that the goals were all discarded outright, or that no progress was made toward any of them. To take the view that there is nothing good whatsoever to be found in the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses, and to engage, as some former witnesses do, in a career of deriding it, manifests only intense bias. When persons leaving do this, it raises questions as to the purity of their motive in leaving. If there was nothing good whatsoever there, then why were they drawn to it in the first place? Or why did they remain in it for 5, 10, 20 or more years? Similarly, with those of other religious affiliations, do they not realize that in many cases, persons entering the witness organization did so precisely because of their disillusionment with the churches to which they had belonged? Frequently, the witness organization wins persons' interests largely by default, the failure in certain areas on the part of many churches being as much a factor as the apparent benefits offered within the witness organization. People are often disillusioned by what they see as hypocrisy among many church leaders and members. They are confused by the multiplicity of denominational divisions and the sectarian spirit which contributes to such divisions. They are concerned about the nationalism expressed, the record of warfare within Christendom, the history of oppression of minorities, and the fact that political action has often been required to bring about racial equality within Christian communities. One former witness living in Northern Virginia, who joined a small church after her separation from the Watchtower organization, related that she had always been a worker when a witness, and so she continued to be a worker in this small congregation. As a result, they began giving her additional responsibility, and this continued over a period of about 2 years. She stated, however, that the farther up the ladder they moved her, the more church politics she saw, and she finally withdrew. Similar disillusionment can and often does result in connection with movements developed by persons who have themselves left the Watchtower organization. The same person just mentioned wrote of a phone call she received from a young woman in her area who had been disfellowshipped for having association with a disfellowshipped person. The woman said she was so adversely affected by a voluminous legal packet sent to her by the Watchtower Society's attorney, Leslie Long, designed to show that any legal action against the society would be futile, that she decided to contact some former witnesses. She first contacted a man whose name she had found through the news media. She related that she spoke with him by phone for close to 2 hours. As a result of his insistent dogmatism in pushing certain orthodox doctrine and his concern for receiving money before mailing her any information, her comment was that she felt that if he had been her only contact with a former witness, she would go back to the Watchtower organization. Another woman living in California wrote, quote, "Your book was a refreshing change from the J.W. bashing, judgmental books written by embittered witnesses. I can understand why some are bitter. I fight that myself, having spent 20 years in the organization. I desperately need to talk with someone for emotional support, but it's so hard to find balanced, non-judgmental advice from groups who seem to have as biased an agenda as the witnesses themselves. I have had enough closed-mindedness to last a long time." A former witness living in Indiana had, due to the repressive position of the organization, taken out a post office box under an assumed name so as to be able to correspond safely with former witnesses. She wrote, quote, "So many ex-JWs I have seen on TV and read their literature show an attitude that turns me off. Perhaps it is smugness or vindictiveness. I feel that they are themselves guilty of the same things they accuse the Watchtower of, half-truths, lifting things out of context, etc." I am sincerely grateful that, as has been true of many, she wrote this letter to me largely because of the feeling that crisis of conscience expressed a different spirit. Self-examination, then, should always precede critical assessment of another's position or claims. Otherwise, we can be focusing on the speck of sawdust in our brother's eye and failing to see the plank in our own. Matthew 7, 1-5. Some indeed focus on and magnify faults or errors found within the witness organization, which are essentially superficial. They see surface problems, but fail to see the more consequential underlying problems. They condemn only in those areas where they feel that their own, generally opposite position and claims will come off looking superior, to the advantage of the particular religious systems they advocate. They fail to see where the crucial principles involved may call for adjustments in their own attitudes, positions, and claims. This resembles Pharisaism more than Christianity. The footnote references Matthew 23, 25-28. In similar fashion, witnesses, when defending their organization, often place great emphasis on what amounts to appearance more than substance, on claim as opposed to reality, perhaps on intent as compared to actual result. There is unquestionably an enormous potential for good in an association with knowings of numbers living in some 200 lands. And that is what I find particularly tragic. The way in which the efforts of sincere persons toward attaining noble goals, an effort marked not only in hours and days and years, but often in entire lives, is so measurably diverted into a channel that causes it to come pitifully short of those goals. The very instrument that is supposed to aid them in furthering those goals proves to be a most serious hindrance to their attainment. It has diverted servants of the Spirit into being prisoners of the organization. The organization has become less the vehicle of an idea than a channel through which particular interests must be served. The spiritual paradise. I say to everyone among you, do not be conceited or think too highly of yourself, but think your way to a sober estimate based on the measure of faith God has dealt to each of you. Romans 12:3, New English Bible. At an international assembly of Jehovah's Witnesses in New York held in 1958, the audience was told, quote, "It is the flourishing of the spiritual paradise that explains the overflowing happiness of Jehovah's Witnesses. This spiritual paradise reflects the glory of God and testifies to the establishment of His kingdom." The footnote references The Awake, May 22nd, 1987, page 15. From that time forward, witnesses have been repeatedly assured that they form such a spiritual paradise and are the happiest, most united, and the cleanest living people on the face of the earth. Prophecies from the Hebrew Scriptures about the desert blossoming as the rose and the land becoming like Eden are said to have had a modern-day spiritual fulfillment in the witness organization. The footnote references The Watchtower, October 1st, 1983, page 5. In glowing word pictures describing the splendor of conditions in this spiritual paradise, the organization is portrayed as one of near-perfect harmony, where former wolf-like persons dwell peacefully with lamb-like persons, humans discarding aggressive traits and putting on personalities marked by peacefulness and love, with no competitions, rivalries, ambitious self-exalting over others, no venomous backbiting or spitefulness, where all feed at a continual banquet of rich spiritual food in a spiritually healthful place in which the fruits of God's Holy Spirit are produced in abundance. The footnote references Mankind's Salvation Out of World Distress at Hand, 1975, pages 188, 203, and 204. Also see The Watchtower, March 15th, 1986, page 20, and October 1st, 1983, pages 4-7. Many of them believe this, particularly those who, as was true in my own case, have known nothing other than membership in the New World Society. They come to view everything outside that society, including all other religious denominations, as largely devoid of genuine moral principle and of genuine love, or at least markedly inferior to the standards and levels their own organization claims to exemplify. Just how far they go can be seen in this statement in the March 15, 1986 Watchtower, page 20. Quote, "Only in this spiritual paradise, among Jehovah's Witnesses, can we find the self-sacrificing love Jesus said would identify his true disciples." John 13, 34, 35. By their bad fruits, false prophets are exposed for what they really are. But Jesus indicated that the good trees would be identified by their fine fruits. Matthew 7, 15 through 20. And what fine fruitage we have in the spiritual paradise. Amazing increases are taking place in practically every country. Because they are taught by God, Jehovah's Witnesses really produce the fruits of Christianity in their lives. Only they have an organization that completely abides by what God's Word has to say on sexual immorality, abortions, drunkenness, stealing, idolatry, racial prejudice, and other worldly pursuits and practices. And they alone are the ones obeying the command to preach the good news of Jehovah's kingdom, Matthew 24:14. God's own word unquestionably points to Jehovah's Witnesses as the one organized people that have his blessing. Though told that this is unquestionable, we owe it to the interests of truth to ask how factual the organizational self-estimate just expressed really is. The claim is not that they are somewhat better, or measurably better, or an improvement on other religions. The claim is of being outstandingly better, of actual exclusivity in these fields. They are unquestionably the sole spiritual oasis in a world desert. In view of the exhortation found in the Apostle Paul's words at Romans 12:3, earlier quoted, urging against thinking more highly of oneself than is warranted, how sober an estimate does the organization's published self-image prove to be? The fruit of faith. The Apostle emphasizes three fruitages of God's Spirit as of greatest importance to the Christian: faith, hope, and love. The footnote references 1 Corinthians 13:13. Faith is the very basis for Christianity. On it, all else is built. The Scriptures themselves teach us to put our faith in God and in His Son. Nowhere in all the Scriptures do we find any instruction or encouragement to place our faith in men or in a human system. The Apostle states, quote, "For the foundation, nobody can lay any other than the one which has already been laid, that is, Jesus Christ. There is nothing to boast about in anything human. Paul, Apollos, Cephas, the world, life and death, the present and the future, all are your servants, but you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God." The footnote references 1 Corinthians 3:11, 21 through 23, Jerusalem Bible. By contrast, the Watchtower publications divert faith from its true object, in a sense fragmented so that it is not wholly and undividedly directed to and based on God and His Son. They encourage people to put faith in a victorious organization, as the wording on the front cover of the March 1st, 1979 Watchtower reads. An entire book could be filled with examples of their wholesale transferal of scriptural statements made about God and Christ to the visible organization. Earlier chapters of this present book have documented the manner in which loyalty to God is equated with loyalty to the visible organization. Submission to God's direction is equated with submission to the visible organization's direction. Trust in God's Word is equated with trust in the Word of the visible organization. As also documented, scriptural statements relating to Christ are in the same way appropriated and applied to the organization. It presumes to share with Christ his role of being the way and the truth and the life. John 14:6. Of all the wrongs evident in the religion, the gravest, I believe, is in this diversion of faith to a human system. The Watchtower organization is not alone among religious systems in doing this, but it certainly presents an outstanding example of assumption, and an assumption that merits the designation of arrogant, of what rightly belongs only to God and Christ. When persons allow themselves to be led along such a course, the purity of their faith cannot but suffer. Genuine faith becomes adulterated with credulity. The greater the diversion of faith in God to faith in men, the more damaging the results. The trust placed in a human system and its apparent strength can eventually reach the point described at Jeremiah 17:5-8, where Jehovah says, quote, "Cursed is the man who trusts in human beings, who seeks his strength in flesh, whose heart turns away from Jehovah. He is like a barren bush in the desert that enjoys no change of season, but stands in a lava waste, a salt and empty earth. Blessed is the man who trusts in Jehovah, whose hope is in Jehovah. He is like a tree planted beside the waters that stretches out its roots to the stream. It fears not the heat when it comes. Its leaves stay green. In the year of drought it shows no distress, but still bears fruit." The footnote reads, NAB rendering. The more one's faith is centered on a human system, whatever that system may be, the less spiritual that one becomes. There are men who are very religious and yet are essentially unspiritual. They are organization men, not men of faith. Their lives may be filled with activity that brings them organizational approval, backing, and the power that such backing affords. If the organizational backing is removed, their apparent strength disappears with it. The footnote reads, compare Revelation 3, 1, 2, 17, and 18. Despite their zeal for a religious organization and its growth and prosperity, their lives may nonetheless be effectively barren of those things which bring God's approval and His strength, barren as to the fruitage of His Spirit in spontaneous, inwardly motivated, faith-impelled acts of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, trustfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The footnote references Galatians 5, 22 and 23, Jerusalem Bible. The same year that I left the Dominican Republic to become part of the international headquarters staff, President Nora assigned me, as one of 4 instructors, to conduct special classes of a kingdom ministry course which the traveling overseers, circuit, and district of the U.S. would attend. The footnote reads, the other instructors assigned were Edward Dunlap, Ulysses Glass, and Fred Rusk. The classes were 2 weeks in length, and the men came in successive groups of 100 per group. I was surprised how well one could get to know 100 men in 2 weeks of class discussion, and I was equally disturbed to realize that out of any group, I never found more than 2 or 3 men who gave evidence of any real depth of understanding, of insight, or, more seriously, of spirituality. The other 97 or 98 were essentially company men, whose service talks manifested some oratorical ability, but in content had incredibly little of spiritual nourishment, often being scarcely more than pep talks. Men who were generally effective at placing literature at the doors, and who in knowledge were above average only in their being very up-to-date on society policy and regulations. At the time, I myself was still a firm believer, convinced that I was part of God's one approved people on earth. Yet I remember saying to myself, is this really the best that we can give our brothers to help them? The Spirit radiated in speech, attitude, and action by those who put faith in a human system is not the heavenly Spirit from God. It reflects a different earthly source. The footnote references James 3, 17 and 18. They may be quick to punish any deviation from organizational norms and dogma. But if they see serious wrongs committed by their religious organization itself, or recognize crucial fallacies in its teachings, they find neither the inner strength nor the courage to speak out and defend what is right, to stand up for truth or against injustice. Instead of producing persons of integrity, their implicit trust and near total subservience to an organizational system and fear of losing its approval converts them into emasculated men. Had all of Jehovah's people of pre-Christian times been like this, there would have been no prophets from whose lives and words we might draw strength and assurance when facing tests of our faith in God rather than in human sources. The footnote reads, compare Isaiah 58:1, Hebrews 11:36-38, and 12:1-3. Nor would there have been Christian apostles who, accused of disrupting the peace of the religious community and undermining the authority of its leadership, would stand before the religious governing body of their people and say, quote, "We cannot stop speaking about the things we have seen and heard. We must obey God rather than men." The footnote references Acts 4:5-12 at 18-20, and also 5:27-29. In latter times, there would have been no historical accounts of men like Wycliffe, Tyndale, Servetus, Huss, Waldo, and others who placed conscience above conformity to our religious authority and who paved the way, in a great or smaller measure, to certain freedoms we today enjoy. None of this is said in a spirit of either judgmentalism or scorn. Personal experience brought home to me the crippling effect that faith in a human organization produces. The weakening effect subservience to human authority has. The ease with which concern to not get out of favor with that authority can subtly infiltrate one's thinking. To free myself from those effects did not come easily. I am satisfied that natural courage does not provide the strength one needs. Persons have faced great peril at the hands of outside opposers in order to be loyal to their religious organization, have even risked their lives in enemy surroundings on behalf of other fellow members of the religion. The footnote references 1 Corinthians 13:3. But that courage of itself gives no guaranteed protection against moral cowardice within that religious organization. Ultimately, how much meaning or merit is there to it if a man takes an uncompromising stand on a certain issue, perhaps spends time in a concentration camp for doing so, and then, when faced with a parallel issue within his religion, now compromises? What genuine significance is there in a person's refusing to engage in conduct that he views as a virtual idolizing of a political state, placing faith in it and giving it near blind allegiance, refusing to make statements that he considers as implying that one's salvation is inextricably connected with that political state, if he then engages in conduct that reflects the virtual idolizing of a religious system, placing faith in it and giving it near blind allegiance, as believing that his salvation is unquestionably tied in with it? Not all witnesses reach that point, but an incredibly large number do, and the message they receive persistently and insistently leads them in that direction. None of us has cause to boast in his own strength or in the strength of a human system. The footnote references 1 Corinthians 1:26, 27, and 29. Faith in God, not faith in the national organization of Israel or in any human leadership, is what distinguished exemplary men of biblical times whose weakness was turned to strength. The footnote references Hebrews 11:32-34, NEB. I think it is safe to say that the great majority of Watchtower affiliates know how to flow along with the crowd, but would find it difficult to function spiritually apart from a human system. Apart from it, they would feel adrift, disoriented, with no real goal in life or the strength to strive for it. If their faith were unadulterated, centered wholly in God rather than largely in men, that would not be the case. The fruitage of hope. The Christian hope undergoes similar adulteration and substitution. Focus is in an opposite direction to that stated by the apostle who wrote, quote, "So if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things that are above, not on things that are on earth." The footnote references Colossians 3, 1 and 2. See also Philippians 3:19. In the first century, it was because of their concern for fulfillment of earthly desires, including liberation from oppression by worldly powers and the restoration and enjoyment of many physical blessings, that many found God's Son a disappointment as to fulfilling their messianic hopes. The footnote reads, compare Luke 24, 17 through 21, John 6, 11, 14, 15, 25 through 27, and Acts 1, 6. They failed to appreciate the far more wonderful liberation and blessing he actually accomplished. Their false hopes blinded them to the true hope and caused them to acquiesce in the death of God's Son. As discussed in a previous chapter, one of the great attractions for people to associate with the Watchtower organization is precisely its emphasis on fulfillment of physical, earthly desires. Those hopes and expectations are simultaneously excited by the assurance that the anticipated fulfillment is soon to be realized, very close, at the doors, right at hand. Assurances that are based on human interpretations and which are repeated over and over again. When foretelling the coming of false messiahs, Christ spoke also of men who would come, saying, "The time is now very near." And of such he counseled, "Never follow men like that." The footnote references Luke 21:8, Phillips Modern English. The true Christian hope is not based on mere desire or wishful thinking, but on reality. That genuine hope is faith-strengthening, contributes to endurance, for it is solidly based and unwavering, an anchor to the soul. The footnote references 1 Thessalonians 1:3 and Hebrews 6:18 through 20 and 11:1 and 2. Because of this, it does not disappoint or defraud, is always reliable, and inspires confidence. The footnote references Romans 5 and 5. By contrast, the hopes excited by the Watchtower, often tied in with certain dates, have again and again led to disappointment, and, for many, to disillusionment. The expectations aroused proved to have had no more substance than a mirage, no more stability than a will-o'-the-wisp, no more constancy than the shimmering, undulating light produced by swamp gas. Young people have confidently believed that they would never grow old in this system of things, and have predicated all their plans and steps on that belief. But they have grown old, and have often faced difficult, even depressing problems because of the decisions they made in earlier years, decisions largely controlled by a falsely based hope. Yet the organization, wedded as it is to its 1914 date, has claimed to know for an absolute certainty that the time is now very near, that people in the particular time frame indicated could confidently believe it is possible to escape from the very experience of dying. There is nothing upbuilding about such illusionary hopes. To the contrary, they are destructive of true hope, weakening to genuine faith. In an unusually candid memorandum sent to the headquarters writing department in 1978, one branch office describes the effect of the organization's chronological speculations and the kind of motivation this produces, saying, quote, "Then there is the question of Bible chronology and motives. Many brothers started to preach positively that the new order would come in 1975 or shortly thereafter. This aroused the interest of some people who sought further information about the new order and liked what they heard. They also became convinced on basic doctrines. So they got baptized and shared in worship with the congregation. Many were evidently motivated by their vision of the new order and the nearness of it. It was largely a materialistic motivation. When 1975 came and passed without bringing in the new order, such ones, not having a strong enough spiritual motivation, saw it best to return to running with the world in the quest of material things, in the hope of enjoying a better order in the present system of things. Sadly, many who were much longer in the truth have been affected in a similar way. Since 1975, or in about 3 years' time, about 30,000 have either drifted away from the truth or have become irregular in the service in this country. The footnote reads, Memorandum from the Watchtower's Nigeria branch office, dated October 12, 1978, page 10. As the Watchtower itself has admitted, the disappointment produced, quote, has in some cases led to spiritual disaster. This is taken from the Watchtower of April 15, 1990, page 27. The branch memorandum quoted, while showing that the effect on many was to give increased support to congregational activities, relates that many started pioneering with that date in view, cut short their studies, restricted regular employment, or refused opportunities for earning more money, neglected their health, and that with that year's passing, quote, felt disappointed and disillusioned. I have seen people very greatly harmed by the false urgency surrounding the 1975 predictions, with some undergoing extreme emotional stress, families facing enduring economic strain for years, men who had given up good jobs having bouts with alcoholism due to the difficulty in finding new employment, elderly persons who faced a bleak future due to using insurance or similar funds prematurely, persons whose physical health was seriously damaged due to putting off surgery or other treatment. If the sacrifice had been for truth, for God, for a noble purpose, then it would be worth it. But it was due to a mental concoction originating with one person and then promulgated by an organization, and it ended in nothing, proved a complete fiction. They may try to shrug it off, but the responsibility for all this rests with those who gave birth to the false hopes, who stirred up and excited illusionary expectations. Both Christ and the Apostle Paul urged for calmness and against letting earthly events and predictions become a source of alarming excitement. The footnote references Matthew 24, 6, 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 and 2. The Greek word rendered terrified at Matthew 24, 6 in the New World Translation is the same word rendered excited at 2 Thessalonians 2, 2. The Watchtower publications do the opposite, utilizing whatever world events may be current to foment agitated presentiment, a sense of something cataclysmic about to occur. They are openly committed to maintaining an unremitting sense of urgency among all members. This is used to fill the roles of both the proverbial carrot and the stick. On the one hand, it entices with the prospect of surviving Armageddon into a new world and never dying. On the other, it serves as a prod toward intensified activity in carrying out the organization's program and working toward its goals. It is an urgency based on significance attached to world events, the implications being those the organization itself attributes to the events. Within this century, as in all previous centuries, we have seen numerous alternating periods of notable violence and of relative peace. The Watchtower organization has found the formula to use either circumstance in creating a sense of imminent disaster. Whenever a period of increased violence and unrest appears, this is pointed to as proof that the predictions made are right and that the time is very near. When those conditions subside, and later quite opposite conditions favorable for greater peace develop, this is nonetheless utilized as evidence that sudden destruction is mere, based on Paul's words about men saying peace and security at 1 Thessalonians 5:3. The Watchtower publications have made statements like these. Quote, "This prophecy makes it clear that, just prior to the end of this system of things, peace and security will be declared in some exceptional way, whether by the United Nations or independently by political and religious leaders." The footnote references The Watchtower, May 15, 1984, page 6. Now, in the waning months of President Reagan's term, and in the thawing atmosphere of Secretary Gorbachev's glasnost policy, there appears to be serious talk about diffusing the nuclear arms situation. Whether this is a prelude to bring about a supposed peace and security for the world in general, we cannot foresee, but in accordance with Bible prophecy, that is what Christians are looking for. The footnote references Awake, April 8th, 1988, page 14. It will come as an unmistakable signal that world destruction is imminent. Taken from True Peace and Security, How Can You Find It? 1986, page 85. Yet the context of the apostle's words are against this very viewpoint, for he states, quote, "About dates and times, my friends, we do not need to write to you, for you know perfectly well that the day of the Lord comes like a thief in the night. While they are talking of peace and security, all at once calamity is upon them." The footnote references 1 Thessalonians 5, 1-3, NEB. Since that day of the Lord comes like a thief, clearly the apostle is not saying that people's talking of peace and security is some sort of signal or alarm in the form of a notable pronouncement. Fees do not supply unmistakable signals or alarms to herald their imminent arrival. It is evident that Paul's words correspond to the words spoken earlier by Christ, that his coming will find people in an apparent state of normalcy, with life going on as usual, people eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, building and planting, with nothing to excite premonitions or give advance indications that judgment is suddenly to begin. The footnote reads, compare Matthew 24, 26-39, 42-44, and Luke 17, 26-30, and 21, 34-36. The periodic pronouncements of peace and security the nations have been making again and again throughout history prove insubstantial and short-lived, and so does any premonition based on them. As far back as 1915, the first Watchtower president, C.T. Russell, expressed the view in a convention that the prophesied time of proclaimed peace had begun with the first peace conference at The Hague in 1899. The footnote reads, "See What Pastor Russell Said" by L.W. Jones, a close associate of Russell, page 529. In this, as in following points, I am indebted to research done by Carl Olaf Johnson. World War I demolished the effects of the Hague Conference. Russell died in 1916 in the midst of that war. In 1917, his successor, J.F. Rutherford, now said that following the war, there would be a short period of peace in fulfillment of the words of 1 Thessalonians 5:3, with the end to come soon thereafter. The footnote reads, see the Watchtower of January 1st, 1917, pages 4 and 5, and December 1st, 1917, page 358. The sudden destruction delayed, however, and in the mid-1930s, Rutherford wrote that now the time had come for the foretold peace pronouncement, according to him to be made from the Roman Catholic hierarchy, preceded by global silencing of the work of Jehovah's Witnesses. The footnote reads, see the booklet, Choosing Riches or Ruin, 1936, pages 31 and 32. The book Enemies, 1937, pages 292 and 293. Instead, World War II began. In 1940, Rutherford wrote that the war would be interrupted by a brief period of peace, immediately followed by Armageddon. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, August 15th, 1940, page 246, and September 1st, 1940, pages 259 to 266. After Rutherford's death in 1942, the booklet Peace, Can It Last?, written by Fred Franz but delivered as a convention keynote speech by N.H. Knorr, continued to affirm, on page 26, that the peace period following World War II will be very short-lived, quickly followed by Armageddon. 60 years later, we were still living in that peace period, one that was longer than any previous period of peace between the major powers in history. The footnote reads, see International Security, Volume 13, 1988, page 80, International Studies Quarterly, 30, December 1986, page 269. In the 1970s, with focus on the year 1975, Watchtower Publications spoke of, quote, strange events taking place in our time, and that the peace and security prophecy seems to be rapidly nearing its fulfillment. The footnote references The Awake, October 8, 1972, page 4, M9. Also, God's Kingdom of 1,000 Years Has Approached, 1973, page 364. 1986 was declared internationally a year of peace, and this allowed for stirring up more excited expectations. The Watchtower brought out its book, True Peace and Security, How Can You Find It?, with its description, already quoted, of a coming peace and security proclamation as an unmistakable signal that world destruction is imminent. In 1990, with the Cold War drawing to its close, the book Mankind's Search for God, page 371, referred again to 1 Thessalonians 5:3, saying, quote, already another outstanding Bible prophecy is approaching fulfillment before our eyes. It would appear that the nations that were formerly belligerent and suspicious of one another are now moving cautiously toward a situation in which they will be able to declare world peace and security. One would think that after 7 decades of stirring up excitement by statements whose worth proved more short-lived than the peace movements on which they were based, an organization would feel moved to humility. Instead, the Watchtower says, quote, the Watchtower Society will continue issuing in its publications timely warnings to the reading public so that you will not be caught off guard by the coming pretentious proclamation, peace and security, as devised by the nations of this old system of things. Taken from the Watchtower, September 1st, 1987, page 23. This is said in the face of the undeniable evidence that all the timely warnings of the past had proved ill-timed, ill-conceived, and ultimately meaningless. The language employed is consistently a mixture of confident-sounding declarations joined with deliberate indefinitiveness and vagueness. The September 8, 1991 Awake, for example, contains this paragraph, quote, Jehovah's Witnesses firmly believe that the United Nations is going to play a major role in world events in the very near future. No doubt these developments will be very exciting, and the results will have a far-reaching impact on your life. The Bible clearly paints a picture showing that the United Nations will shortly be given power and authority. The UN will then do some very astonishing things that may well amaze you, and you will be thrilled to learn that there is a better way near at hand that will surely bring eternal peace and security. The powerful rhetoric, the very near future, very exciting, astonishing things, may well amaze you, serve only to dazzle the reader and hinder him from realizing that nothing solid has really been said. If he turns to the scripture texts on which these claims are supposedly based, Revelation 17, 7 through 14, he will find only a description of a symbolic wild beast with 7 heads, stated as representing 7 kings, and 10 horns, representing 10 other kings, and of an 8th king belonging to the 7. The picture, which he is told the Bible clearly paints, turns out to depend entirely on the Watchtower's particular interpretation of these symbols. Compare the kind of language used in that 1991 magazine with the following, quote, "We can expect the immediate future to be filled with thrilling events for those who rest their faith in God and His promises. It means that within relatively few years, we will witness the fulfillment of the remaining prophecies that have to do with the time of the end. The immediate future is certain to be filled with climactic events, for this old system is nearing its complete end. Within a few years at most, the final parts of Bible prophecy relative to these last days will undergo fulfillment, resulting in the liberation of surviving mankind into Christ's glorious 1,000-year reign. What difficult days, but at the same time, what grand days are just ahead." The same exciting language about the immediate future appears as in the 1991 publication previously quoted. But these last two quotations and their predictions were based entirely on now discarded claims relative to the year 1975, and they appeared in the October 8, 1966 Awake and the May 1st, 1968 Watchtower. The few years at most which were to see fulfilled the final parts of Bible prophecy relative to these last days have already extended to more than a quarter of a century. All the excited sense of urgency these speculative tactics produce differs greatly from an urgency based on the undeniable uncertainty of life itself, and our being, due to the comparative brevity of our lives, like a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. James 4:13-15. A sober realization of these facts can give us a proper, healthful sense of urgency, one founded on a reality. In the same way, the very unpredictableness of the coming of God's day of judgment can impel us to always be awake and sober, so that whenever that day breaks, it will find us ready. The footnote references Matthew 24:42 and 44, Luke 21:34, 36, and 1 Thessalonians 5:6-8. Whether we personally live to see that occur or die beforehand, our hope will be unaffected, its realization assured. It would be wrong to think that Jehovah's Witnesses are not taught to hope in the power of the resurrection from death through Christ. They are, and they do. But for the vast majority, those not of the anointed class, that hope is overlaid with the hope that, as witnesses, they may not need to experience that scripturally taught hope, that they may escape the need to benefit from it. This is an effort to shut out reality from one's mind, for it can be said that death is a fact of life. The Scriptures deal with that hard fact. They do not entice us with some other more palatable alternative. Those of the non-anointed class are told that if they manage to live until and through the Great Tribulation, their marriages will continue in effect. If they die faithful before the Great Tribulation, they will be resurrected to life on earth, but then must live forever in a celibate state. The extremes to which these man-created hopes can affect thinking are remarkable. A friend in the writing staff at the international headquarters attended the same congregational book study that Maxwell Friend attended. Maxwell was one of the senior members at the headquarters, had served for many years as an instructor for Gilead School. The footnote reads, "He had been a Shakespearean actor in his pre-witness days in his native Switzerland, and his voice was used in many of the Watchtower Convention drama tapes." In the 1970s, after one book study night, my friend related to me that Maxwell had told the study group, quote, "Well, my prayers have been answered." When asked what he meant, he replied that he had been praying that all his non-witness relatives would die before the Great Tribulation began. In that way, they would qualify for a resurrection, whereas if they were alive when the Great Tribulation hit, they would be destroyed eternally with no hope of a resurrection. He informed the group that he had just learned that his last living non-witness relative had died. Thus, his prayers were answered. It seems incredible that anyone could believe that the extension or withdrawal of divine mercy, with all the serious consequences implied therefrom, could be governed thus by a timetable believing that a person's dying one day or even 1 hour before the Great Tribulation's beginning would give hope of his being resurrected, but his dying 1 day or 1 hour after would not. Surely the individual would be essentially the same person at either time. This, and all the other preoccupations with time and time periods and signs and signals, does nothing to stir healthful appreciation of the biblical hope. Concern for truth. By all means, use your judgment and hold on to whatever is good. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, Phillips Modern English. Faith and hope are inseparably linked to truth. Without it, they become mere credulity and illusion. The adulterating of the faith and hope taught in Scripture results in a consequent weakening of appreciation for the importance of truth within the spiritual paradise. It should be readily admitted that there are fine statements of Christian conduct to be found within the literature of the Watchtower organization, including articles praising and encouraging compassion, mercy, modesty, humble admission of mistakes, and similar hard qualities. It is simply that what is said so frequently is not what is done. Matthew 23:3. To use the words of former Catholic theologian Davis, in place of concern for truth and concern for people, there is, quote, concern for authority at the expense of truth. And this clearly has produced an impersonal and unfree system. Not that concern for truth and concern for people are completely absent. It is rather that they are so severely subordinated to supposed organizational interests that they become expendable. I know personally many very intelligent, perceptive persons, men and women, among Jehovah's Witnesses. I know that many of them, including certain members of the governing body, have recognized quite a few of the serious errors in the organization's teachings and in their application. Yet these persons have continued to uphold the organization as God's chosen instrument on earth. I believe that inevitably their intelligence, at least the exercise of it, suffers as a result, is blunted, stifled, and continually diverted into efforts at rationalizing away wrong. Some of them are capable writers, but they write always with the consciousness that what they write must conform to the organizational creed, the particular spirit dominating at the time. They may write articles which are essentially healthful in content. Yet, as part of the whole and coming from the organizational source, these serve the ultimate purpose of enhancing the organization structure in the minds of readers and promoting the submission to its authority, which it seeks, thereby binding persons to a system. Among the men, most of them will accept assignments to give talks at assemblies, even if these contain statements and arguments that they themselves believe to be wrong. Their personal integrity suffers. They are acting a part, not being themselves, not being true to themselves. Studies made of mass behavior and mind control, as during the Mouncy regime, show that among the most powerful factors have been the altering and control of people's behavior, group conformity, and a virtual unquestioning obedience to authority, generally accompanied by control of information received. People naturally have a sense of personal identity through their thoughts, their feelings, and their actions or behavior. It has been found that if one of these elements is changed, the other two tend to change along with it. Thus, if a change can be effected in a person's behavior pattern, the person's thoughts and feelings will also generally change, for otherwise he feels an intolerable sense of discrepancy and conflict or dissonance within himself. When not only is there a channeling of his time into a restricted and constant program of specific activities, but also his entire behavioral pattern, his pattern of conduct, speech, and dealings with others, is affected and altered, the person will feel an inner compulsion to adjust his thinking and his feelings or emotions to accommodate this change, in a sense, to validate the new behavioral pattern. His view of himself, his set of values may all be adjusted to conform to the changed behavioral pattern. If that pattern is an imposed one submitted to only because of a supposed superior authority, it may not only rob him of his freedom of action, it may also rob him of his freedom of thought and freedom of feeling. When a person enters a highly scheduled program, such as, but not limited to, that of the Watchtower organization, he is made to feel that his very faithfulness to God is indicated by conformity to that program. It is not only the stress on a program of meetings and field service that exerts force. His behavior in speech, actions, and attitude must all conform to a pattern. Witnesses in time become hypersensitive to any expression or remark that sounds even slightly deviant to the organizational norm. The person's behavior toward former friends and neighbors similarly is altered, since he is now expected to view them all as worldlings and deal with them accordingly. He becomes subject to a whole host of regulations and policies involving his employment, his relationships with all the people with whom he has daily contact, even relatives who are not witnesses, his recreation, what he reads, and other facets of life. With such a drastic alteration to his previous conduct and behavior, there is the tendency to rationalize all else, to make it harmonize with and justify the conformity called for. Only in this way can a relative peace of mind be obtained, though at a price. The footnote reads, "A letter I received from a former witness in Nigeria quite incisively expresses this. He said he was writing to convey his appreciation for gaining, quote, greater insight into the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses and organizations I mortgaged my conscience to from my childhood to my adulthood. This control of behavioral patterns is strong toward all witnesses, even though most live in their own homes as family members and engage in secular work. How much more does it exert power towards those who are part of institutional families, part of the headquarters staff with its thousands of members, or of the branch office staffs, all living together in multiple dwelling buildings, eating together in large dining rooms, spending the majority of their waking and working hours surrounded by persons who are all conforming to the prescribed behavioral pattern? The subconscious inner compulsion to adjust one's thinking, outlook, sense of values, standards to fit the pattern is especially great for them. The dissonance they would otherwise experience would be intolerable. I feel that some of those I know personally are far more captive of their circumstances than they realize. This tendency to make thoughts and feelings conform to a behavioral pattern seems to be at least one explanation why, when clear errors in organizational teachings or policies are pointed out to them, most witnesses will either refuse to acknowledge them or deny their importance. When describing the process commonly used in mind control, one source states, quote, "Another key aspect of thought control involves training members to block out any information which is critical of the group. A person's typical defense mechanisms are twisted so they defend the person's new religious identity against his old former identity. The first line of defense includes denial. What you say isn't happening at all. Rationalization. This is happening for a good reason. Justification. This is happening because it ought to be. And wishful thinking. I'd like it, the belief, to be true, so maybe it really is. If information transmitted is perceived as an attack on either the leader, the doctrine, or the group, a hostile wall goes up. Members are trained to disbelieve any criticism. Loyalty and devotion are the most highly respected emotions of all. People are not allowed to talk to each other about anything critical of the leader, doctrine, or organization. Members must spy on one another and report improper activities or comments to leaders. Most importantly, people are told to avoid contact with ex-members or critics." The footnote references Combating Cult Mind Control, pages 61 through 65. The source quoted does not treat specifically of Jehovah's Witnesses, does not in fact even mention them, but the description fits them remarkably. Truth, in the biblical sense, is not merely intellectual or academic. It goes beyond simple concern for the factualness or fallaciousness of ideas and doctrines. It embraces not merely one's thinking, but one's actions, one's dealings with others, the influence one exercises on others. Concern for truth involves honesty in all these aspects. If we are dishonest with ourselves, refusing to face the hard facts of reality, we can hardly avoid becoming dishonest with others. I believe that is why those doing writing for the organization can allow themselves to present information that is not only not factual, but which, in many cases, is in a sense dishonest. It is no real proof of love of truth, then, to simply use it as an instrument to expose the fallacies in the belief systems of others. The real test of our love of truth is when it exposes fallacies in our own belief system, and we not only accept it, but are grateful to be freed from the error. The fruitage of love. While faith is the figurative soil in which all the fruits of God's Spirit are rooted, the superlative fruit among these is love, for it gives worth and meaning to all the others. As the apostle expressed it, quote, "If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." The footnote references 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3, NRSV. Obviously, love of God comes first, with love of neighbor next. And yet, as the Apostle John makes clear, we cannot have one without the other. The absence of one is the denial of the other. The footnote references 1 John 2, 9-11, and 3, 11-24, 4, 7-12, and 16-21. I believe that, even as with faith and hope, for Jehovah's Witnesses, the meaning of love for God has been blurred, distorted. We can never lose from sight that, in our service to God, what we do is never as important as why we do it, the motivation with which we do it, the spirit in which we do it. These are the factors that give meaning to our works and invest them with the ability to show that we have not a dead faith, but a living faith. The footnote references James 2:12 and 24-26, and goes on to read, "Rahab's course, cited by James, clearly illustrates a completely spontaneous action, not some prescribed act done on order from an earthly authority." The highly structured programs of activity, the emphasis on numerical reports and figures that are so prominent in the Watchtower system, tend to blur this truth, cause its importance to fade. Regularity in performing what the program calls for becomes the criterion, and people become very conscious of the need to be a regular publisher, regular in meeting attendance. Previously, many quotas were published as to numbers of magazines placed, return visits made, hours spent in the field. Though no longer openly stated, invisible quotas remain, and those not meeting them, particularly elders and ministerial servants, soon realize this. Focus is on the externals, on outward conformity, regularity, rather than on heart motivation. The mere doing of the prescribed programs produces a sense of having performed faithful service to God, and usually assures organizational approval. Thus, the branch memorandum earlier mentioned makes this observation. Quote, "Sadly, many have lost their spiritual appetite. Perhaps quite a number of the new ones never did develop a real appetite for the food necessary for our spiritual existence. This observation applies as much to the elders as to the brothers in general. One cannot help wondering whether a considerable fraction of the whole association of our brothers have come to regard our religion as just a matter of routine, just going through the motions. Isaiah 29:13. The footnote reads, Memorandum from the Nigerian Branch Office, page 8. Rather than just a considerable fraction, the evidence is that this routine service attitude is true of the larger number of witnesses. That same outlook was evident among many in Israel. Their regular presentation of multitudes of sacrifices, offerings, incense, prayers, their regular fastings, celebration of Sabbaths and feastal seasons, all done in conformity to the law code, presumably should have assured Jehovah's blessing. Of them Jehovah said, quote, They ask counsel of me day by day, and say they delight in knowing my ways. They ask me for righteous laws, and say they delight in approaching God. Yet, despite all they were doing, Jehovah said he found no delight in their offerings and service, declared them valueless, even detestable. Why? Because while zealous in prescribed works, they were showing insensitivity to the needs of others. Of their fasting and self-mortification, he goes on to say, quote, You serve your own interest only on your fast day, and make all your men work the harder, since your fasting leads only to wrangling and strife, and dealing vicious blows with the fist. On such a day you are keeping no fast that will carry your cry to heaven. Is not this what I require of you as a fast? To loose the fetters of injustice, to untie the knots of the yoke, to snap every yoke and set free those who have been crushed? Is it not sharing your food with the hungry, taking the homeless poor into your house, clothing the naked when you meet them, and never evading a duty to your kinsfolk? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and soon you will grow healthy, etc. Then if you call, the Lord, Jehovah, Yahweh, will answer. If you cry to him, he will say, Here I am. If you cease to pervert justice, to point the accusing finger and lay false charges, if you feed the hungry from your own plenty and satisfy the needs of the wretched, then your life will rise like dawn out of darkness, and your dusk will be like noonday. The Lord Jehovah will be your guide continually, and will satisfy your needs in the shimmering heat. He will give you strength of limb. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. The footnote references Isaiah 58, 2-11, NEB. Compare Isaiah 1, 11-17. The writers of the Christian scriptures show that God has not changed in his outlook. His Son gave a similar message in his day, and his disciples did likewise. The footnote references Matthew 6, 1-16, Matthew 15, 8, 9, and 23, verse 23, James 1, 26-27, and 2, 14-16, 1 John 3, 17-18. Physical bondage is largely a thing of the past, but spiritual, mental, and emotional bondage remain, and religious organizations are often the cause. Through his prophet, Jehovah condemned the dealing of vicious blows. The Apostle Paul spoke of those in his day who, professing to be zealous disciples, even apostles, were exalting themselves, enslaving, ordering about, and literally or figuratively, physically or verbally, slapping fellow believers. The footnote references 2 Corinthians 11, 5, 9, 12-14, and 20. We have seen how religious authority expresses the same spirit today. Through Isaiah, Jehovah spoke of the need to untie and snap every yoke, setting free those burdened and weighed down. Christ described regulations and prohibitions arbitrarily imposed by religious authorities as heavy burdens, and his disciples recognized that even the law had been a yoke difficult to bear. The footnote references Matthew 23, 1 through 3, Acts 15, 10 and 11, and Galatians 5 and 1. Legalism and insistent pressures to perform specified activities and to observe imposed prohibitions, with failure to conform creating the heaviness of guilt, continue to this day. Concern for authority similarly leads to organizational perversions of justice, pointing the accusing finger and laying of false charges that differ only in form to those spoken of by the prophet. Love of neighbor. The substituting of organizational loyalty in place of concern for truth inevitably produces a degree of insensitivity to people and their needs. There are as many normally loving persons among Jehovah's Witnesses as among any other religion. It is not that they now cease to be loving persons. Rather, it is that their expression of that love is markedly restricted, reduced in occasion, degree, and scope. They do not feel free, sometimes not even impelled, to express that love as they otherwise might. When Jesus gave the parable illustrating genuine love of neighbor, he chose not the figure of a fellow Israelite or Judean, but that of a Samaritan, a man of another nation, whose religion differed from that of the Jews in general, whose religion many of them despised, a man toward whom they felt superior in their righteousness. The footnote references Luke 10, 29 through 37, Luke 17, 15 through 18, John 4, 9, and 8, 48. He said that sonship with God, who makes his sun rise on wicked people and good, and makes it rain upon righteous people and unrighteous, is not demonstrated simply by love and warmth toward one's brothers, while being cool and distant in one's dealings with all others. It called for love toward those whom it is most difficult to love, even those who appear as enemies, and for the expression of a friendly attitude toward not just one's brothers, but those not one's brothers, toward outsiders. The footnote references Matthew 5, 43 through 48, and reads, "The word rendered greet may carry the thought of to act in a friendly manner. See the Expositor's Greek Testament, Volume 1, page 115. Jesus practiced what he taught, was willing to share meals and be a guest at homes where a Pharisee would never have set foot, causing him to be vilified and denounced as a man gluttonous and given to drinking wine, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." The footnote references Matthew 11, 19, and John 4, 9, and 40. By contrast, the Watchtower organization fosters the spirit of a closed society, whose only interest toward persons in the community outside is to seek to convert them to membership in that society. It essentially instills the feeling that only in case of some dire emergency, some natural disaster, accident, or other life-threatening situation, is there particular reason for a witness otherwise to show interest in the needs of those outside his brotherhood. The footnote reads, "And when help is given to outsiders in such emergencies, it is almost always published thereafter in Watchtower or Awake articles. Contrast Jesus' words at Matthew 6, 1 through 4. Unquestionably, there are witnesses who do not manifest this restricted, ungenerous outlook, who do not parcel out their warmth and friendship in such a way, who show a friendly, caring spirit toward neighbors and fellow members of the community. I believe, however, that most persons who have witnesses as neighbors view them as essentially orderly, law-abiding people, but also find them generally cool and distant. Most witnesses feel that for them to go to a meal in the home of worldly neighbors or others would lead to organizational criticism in very much the same terms as those in religious authority employed against Jesus. One of the first things that seriously disturbed me was being made aware of the lack of neighbor love, even within the witness organization, and this on the part of these at the top level thereof. The manner in which, after only brief discussions, decisions could be made that would seriously affect the lives of thousands of persons was more than anything else would upset me. I came to realize that the concept of the exalted importance of organization allowed for men to develop an attitude that I can only describe as cynical toward the rest of the brotherhood, and still not feel a sense of guilt. Statements made in governing body sessions time and again conveyed the viewpoint that the rank and file among the witnesses needed to be strictly controlled through rulings and policies to avoid widespread wrongdoing. The genuineness of the heart motivation of witnesses generally was in this way placed in question. The spirit among many governing body members seemed to be one of trust only ourselves, not the rest of the claimed brotherhood. The footnote reads, see also Crisis of Conscience, pages 46 through 56 and 111 through 171. The sense of responsibility toward others is seriously diminished. There is no sense of guilt in presenting a slanted picture of the organization's past history by the method of withholding facts that are unfavorable and which facts are not generally accessible to the majority of witnesses. When predictions based on certain dates have proved in error, the attitude essentially has been, simply say nothing about it, and the people, the body of witnesses, will soon forget it. Governing body members could even have their own personal doubts about the validity of claims regarding 1914 without feeling any need to make any cautionary statements to the witnesses in general as to putting implicit trust in those claims. The footnote reads, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 172 to 254. In this and in many other ways, a cynical attitude is shown, one demeaning to the intelligence of the witness community as a whole. An example of this attitude is seen in the change regarding distribution of literature. On February 25, 1990, the announcement was made in the United States that from March 1, 1990 onward, Watchtower literature would be distributed free on a complete donation basis, with no specified contribution stated. In Kingdom Halls throughout the country, organizationally supplied information was read to witnesses, presenting this change in policy as one based on concern to, quote, greatly simplify our Bible education work and separate ourselves from those who commercialize religion. It was presented as making the literature more accessible to all persons. Thus, the entire change in policy was cloaked in wrappings of charitableness and freedom from self-interest. The footnote reads, an initial step had been taken at the U.S. District Conventions in 1989 toward this change when newly released publications were offered free to those in attendance, though with contribution boxes placed conveniently nearby. The monthly Watchtower publication, Our Kingdom Ministry, of May 1990, contained a supplement which quoted a letter from one family saying, quote, one outstanding new feature that really touched our hearts was the way you released the new publications. My wife and I were moved to really open up and give far more than we ever have at any assembly throughout the many years we have been associated. This illustrates the idea the organization wishes to develop in the membership, that the free literature policy change is purely motivated by a generous, charitable interest in people. What is nowhere stated is that, long before the announcement was made, the Watchtower Society knew that the right of a state to tax a religious ministry's sale of religious literature had become an issue before the courts. This arose with regard to the imposition of a 6% tax by the state of California on literature distributed by the Jimmy Swaggart Ministries, Swaggart being one of the more prominent American televangelists. The Watchtower Society, along with National Councils of Churches of Christ, the California Society for Krishna Consciousness, and other religious groups, had filed an acimus curiae friend of the court brief, in this case urging the court to declare unconstitutional a state's about taxing the sale of religious literature by a religious organization. The footnote reads, "See, among many similar news reports, the report in the Washington Post of January 18, 1990. On January 17, 1991, however, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a state had that right. The following month, February 1991, the Watchtower Society issued its announcement of the change of policy to a free literature distribution. That announcement contained not one word about the matter of taxation. It conveyed to the witness membership the idea that the organization's decision had been reached purely on the basis of other charitable and selfless concerns. This is clearly cynicism in a blatant form. An article in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution of March 3, 1990, based in part on an interview with attorney for the Watchtower, Philip Brumley, stated, quote, "Several Supreme Court decisions, including a recent decision ruling that California could tax literature and tapes sold by Jimmy Swaggart's ministry, convinced witness leaders to dispense with the suggested donation," Mr. Brumley said. If the motivating factor was indeed to make the message contained in the Watchtower literature more easily available to all people, why is it that this free literature policy currently is limited to the United States, Canada, Germany, and Italy, all countries with a notably strong economy? Why is it not worldwide? Or if a gradual introduction was considered advisable, why did it not see its beginning in some of the poorer countries of the world? Why would it not be first implemented in the so-called third world countries where poverty is so extensive? If the new policy is to show that they are separate from those who commercialize religion, why did it continue with the old policy in all these other countries? The fact is that even the word free is rather hollow when compared with actual practice. Previously, witnesses purchased their literature at the Kingdom Hall and, when placing it with the public, asked for a specified contribution and kept the amount received to compensate for what they had initially spent to obtain it. Now, they obtain their literature at the hall without directly paying for it, but a contribution box is placed alongside the literature counter, and there is an obvious sense of pressure to contribute for whatever they receive. Then, on placing the literature with the public, they are counseled to inform the householder taking literature that a donation is acceptable for the literature, though without specifying any amount. If a donation is made, the witness is instructed that he or she should not keep that donation, thereby covering his or her costs of the literature, but should turn it in as money donated to the Watchtower Society. Thus, in many, possibly most cases, the organization is not only receiving what it received before, but actually double what it received before. When some publication is now advertised in one of the Watchtower journals, the advertisement may say nothing of a donation. However, if the reader writes in requesting the publication and does not send an accompanying donation, the headquarters practice is to have a local witness visit the individual at his home, carrying the requested publication, this method allowing for the witness to bring up the suggestion of a donation for it. The footnote reads, "It may be noted that other religious organizations, such as the Worldwide Church of God, have for decades given their literature away free to the public, and this without any implied expression of an interest in a donation." Simultaneously, the organization has adopted the policy of offering meals at assembly cafeterias free to those attending the assemblies. This, too, had a precedent. I recall in the 1970s, while I was on the governing body, that the West German government imposed a heavy tax on the Watchtower branch, stating that the cafeteria operations at assemblies were clearly profit-making operations. The equivalent of more than $1 million was raised by the German witnesses to pay for the tax. In the U.S., all those charged with the administration of assemblies, called district assembly overseers, have long been instructed that the cafeteria operation should produce sufficient profit to cover all assembly expenses. Witnesses may have thought that the monies they put in the many contribution boxes at the assembly sites were used to cover such expenses, but the assembly overseers were specifically told that all such contributions were to go directly to the Watchtower Society, not to be used to cover assembly expenses. One wonders how long it will take the organization to extend these policies to the poorer countries of the world. They may possibly find that, unlike results in the economically strong countries where the policies now apply, their material returns will be lessened when and if they do so, for not only would the public in those poorer countries be less likely to make donations for literature accepted, but many witnesses would find themselves financially unable to bear the expense of giving literature to people without at least being able to cover the cost to themselves. As it is, the words the organizational leadership sends out in praise of their new policy continue to ring hollow, and their failure to frankly acknowledge to the membership the factors behind the change, actually disguising the reason, remains a remarkable evidence of cynicism, a manifestation of a certain contempt for their intelligence. This is hardly the neighbor love that does unto the other as one would have done to oneself. Loving friendship. A true companion is loving all the time, and is a brother that is born for when there is distress. Proverbs 17:17. We remember the claim that, quote, only in the spiritual paradise among Jehovah's Witnesses can we find the self-sacrificing love Jesus said would identify his true disciples. Anyone observing or mingling with Jehovah's Witnesses gathered at a kingdom hall before and after a meeting or at one of their large assemblies would bear testimony to a sense of camaraderie and unity and apparent happiness among them. The question is whether that is of itself the true test of the claims made, particularly of the depth of these feelings. Is that sense genuinely unique, distinctively different from the sense of camaraderie, unity, and apparent happiness one can see in the gatherings of many other affiliations, not only among those of a particular religious affiliation, but even among those united in some social cause? Since witnesses are virtually prohibited from being present at any such gatherings other than their own, they have no other standard than themselves by which to judge. This can only call to mind these words of Paul, quote, "For we do not dare to class ourselves among some, or compare ourselves with some who recommend themselves, or write their own testimonials," Phillips Modern English. Certainly they, in measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves with themselves, have no understanding. The footnote references 2 Corinthians 10:12. The value of a good and loyal friend is beyond measure. One would think that in a spiritual paradise, such friendships would flourish. As in any religious community, friendships do develop among Jehovah's Witnesses, some of them close ones. I had a number of close friendships during my years of association, and a considerable portion of those persons are still my friends, for they held similar values, and those values generally led eventually to their own disengagement from the witness organization. But I have also come to realize how conditional most friendships within the witness community are. This is not primarily the fault of the people, for they are, by and large, like people anywhere. It is instead the effect of the system on their attitudes and relationship. In reality, mere acceptance within the community is completely conditional. As we have seen, the April 1st, 1986 issue of the Watchtower states on page 31, quote, "Approved association with Jehovah's Witnesses requires accepting the entire range of the true teachings of the Bible, including those scriptural beliefs that are unique to Jehovah's Witnesses." Acceptance of the true teachings of the Bible does not go far enough. It must be extended by the additional qualification of those scriptural beliefs that are unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. The footnote reads, "Actually, many of the beliefs listed in the Watchtower material are by no means unique. Seventh-day Adventists, the Worldwide Church of God, and others also believe in the nearness of Armageddon, the millennial reign of Christ, the establishment of an earth-wide paradise. These beliefs, and yet others claimed as unique, are found in several Bible student groups, such as the Dawn Fellowship, the Layman's Home Missionary Movement, and in religions such as the Church of God of the Abrahamic faith. Most of these have origins dating back into the 1800s. Belief in Christ's being subordinate to the Father is by no means unique to witnesses. The only truly unique beliefs among those the Watchtower article lists are those which would identify the faithful and discreet slave as associated with the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. Even the date 1914 is given importance in some of these other religious groups, and it is only the particular application which the Watchtower Society now gives to that date which is unique. While claiming to be distinct from religions holding to a creed, one often hoary with centuries of age, the Witness organization has its own creed, even if certain of its elements may be as new as yesterday. The term creed itself is avoided and is simply replaced by expressions such as the grand body of truth that Jehovah has built up among his united people over the past 100 years, or pattern of the pure language that Jehovah has so graciously taught his people over the past century. The footnote references the Watchtower, August 15, 1981, page 28. But such terminology only produces a distinction without a difference, for a creed claims to be just that, an officially outlined body of fundamental beliefs to be accepted as divine truth by those adopting the creed. Any claimed difference with other religions in this respect disappears under examination. The creed may change. What was once taught may be rejected, perhaps later be reinstated, but whatever the creed is at the time must be completely embraced or one faces rejection as an approved associate. In the spiritual paradise, any friendship is therefore predicated upon that condition. How solid a basis for friendship is this? As noted, many of the doctrinal beliefs have been extremely fluid, some changing with almost kaleidoscopic variety and frequency. This became sufficiently evident, even to the leadership, that they often used the expression present truth. The footnote reads, see Crisis of Conscience, page 217. The expression appears as recently as 1988 in the book Revelation, Its Grand Climax at Hand, page 8, which speaks of, quote, the need to keep up to date with present truth. Doing this despite the fact that from its early use in Watchtower publications, the phrase is one adopted from the King James or Authorized Version rendering of 2 Peter 1:12, a rendering that is nowhere followed by any modern translation, including the Society's own New World Translation. The thought is not of present in the sense of being current, a temporal sense, but in the sense of presence, of location, hence of truth that had already been received and was with or in those to whom Peter wrote. The New English Bible, for example, reads, quote, I will not hesitate to remind you of this again and again, although you know it and are well grounded in the truth that has already reached you. The Watchtower writer, in employing this out-of-date expression, is himself failing to follow his own urging to keep up to date. Examples of doctrinal change are remarkably numerous and can only bring to mind and confirm the rightness of the principles sent out in Jesus' statements about the disappointing results of building on sand, which shifts and lacks stability, and about the vain emptiness of worship that is built around human regulations, as also the Apostle Paul's reference to the undesirableness of being as children, quote, at the mercy of every chance wind of teaching and of the jockeying of men, as they tack this way and that in advancing their views. The footnote references Matthew 7:24-27, 15:9, Ephesians 4:14, Phillips Modern English, and 2 Timothy 3:7. For examples of shifting teachings and policies, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 9, 10, and footnotes 57-65, and 172 through 272. Only the fool refuses to change. The sensible person recognizes his own limitations and imperfections. True wisdom has as its inseparable companions both modesty and humility. The footnote references James 3:13. But if it is foolish to refuse to change, it is equally foolish to base one's trust, one's convictions, on that which is unstable, to commit oneself to a belief system which is built upon the fluctuating, shifting views of imperfect men. The lamentable factor in the history of the Witness organization is not primarily the instability of its teachings, but its insistence, particularly from the 1920s forward, that all must accept whatever teachings happen to be current as though they were solid, stable truth. To accept them means being in the truth. To reject any of them places one outside the truth. Friendship conditioned on such acceptance requires one to shift whenever the teachings shift. Otherwise, the conditional friendship is endangered. The real test of any friendship is how it responds to difficulties. In an article entitled "True Friends, Why So Hard to Find?" the Watchtower comments, quote, "Some people are superficial, concerned only with the surface aspects of life. Others are not willing to make the sacrifices necessary for friendship. Don't get involved," is the advice one often hears these days. As one elderly woman observed, "They love, but at a distance." Even in cultures where profuse hugging and kissing are common courtesies, there may be a lack of real support when dire need strikes. Under the subheading "Shallow Friendships," the article goes on to say, quote, "Many people nevertheless claim that they do have friends, but how much depth is there to such relationships? Often a person takes an interest in someone because of what one has to offer, not because of what he is. Such friendships are therefore likely to be short-lived, for as soon as the friend ceases to be useful, he or she is promptly discarded." The footnote references the Watchtower of May 15, 1985, pages 3 and 4. I believe that any witness who takes time to weigh matters will realize how greatly friendships among witnesses, ultimately and in the final analysis, is predicated on one's being in favor with the organization and what he has to offer in such an organizational context, not on what he is as a person, or the qualities he has, or the values he upholds. The person's qualities or values have merit only as they conform to and advance the organizational interests. That kind of friendship is very much like one that stems primarily from one's holding membership in good standing within a club, lodge, union, or similar group. The intense stress on performance within the organizational works program strongly affects attitudes. Persons who at one time contributed much to the organization's support by their intense activity in field service, and who, due to economic difficulties, health problems, family matters, or other causes, have had to greatly reduce their activity, all too often find that interest in them wanes in proportion to this decrease in what they can now give in service. Some who engaged in full-time service as pioneers, missionaries, traveling overseers, doing so until older age, find that there is truly nothing reciprocatory about it all. While they had something to give, the organization gladly accepted their sacrifices and whatever increase in membership it helped produce. But when they no longer had the ability to give in the form desired, they were in effect shelved, receiving a form letter acknowledging their past service and thereafter essentially forgotten. Unlike other religious systems, the organization has no realistic retirement provisions for such long-time representatives. Men, along with their wives, who spent years in circuit work, moving from place to place, week after week, when no longer able to keep up with the demanding schedule, are put on what is called the infirm special pioneer list. The monthly allowance they receive could never, of itself, adequately cover the cost of living in today's world. Unless they receive help from relatives or past acquaintances, they must often live a life of genuine austerity. Many are essentially objects of charity. The warmth of interest shown in them, the degree of esteem and expressions of appreciation rarely continue on the same level. They are the same people, have the same qualities, but, to use the words of the Watchtower, what they have to offer has diminished, and they are not as useful as in the past. The footnote reads, as in the case of Sue Walker, related in an earlier chapter, such Christian activity as caring for aged parents is not viewed as being as meritorious as activity in some theocratic service, such as being a missionary or serving at Bethel. Throughout the organization, a notably large number of men who faithfully served as elders for years have, in the past decade or so, decided to resign their eldership. At times, the reason has been that they simply feel that their wives and children deserve more of their time and attention. At other times, it has been because they could not conscientiously enforce certain organizational policies or advocate certain teachings. In resigning, they may have preferred not to make known these feelings and have only said the resignation was for personal reasons. Yet many such have expressed that this step caused an unexpected reaction of sudden coolness on the part of the congregation, even a diminishing of friendships, in some cases a virtual rejection, the announcement of their no longer being elders causing fellow witnesses to view them as if they should now be avoided as wrongdoers. In the following article on how to find true friends, the Watchtower cited spoke of fair weather friends and said that a true friendship, quote, rests upon an appreciation of the true worth of the one befriended. A solid friend will be unwavering and will adhere to his friendship regardless of the trialsome or difficult conditions or the heart-searching circumstances that may develop. The loyal friend does not hold back from telling the truth out of fear of another person's reaction. The wounds inflicted by a lover are faithful, says the Bible, Proverbs 27:6. A true friend will love you for telling the truth, even if it is corrective counsel, Proverbs 9:8. It is also the course of wisdom to avoid being overly inquisitive, personal, or possessive. Modesty will move us to avoid being dogmatic. Surely, friendship does not give us the right to force our opinions or personal tastes on one another. The Watchtower, May 15th, 1985, pages 5, 6, and 9. All these statements express noble sentiments and truths. In their application in the magazine, however, they are all used to advance the view that true friendship can be found only within the witness community. Within that community, the criterion for showing friendship and the loyalty characterizing a true friend is tied firmly to organizational conformity. Many witnesses do have qualities that would make for the finest of friends: a genuinely affectionate nature, unselfish concern for others' interests, modesty, open-mindedness, respect for another's privacy, and right to his or her own opinions. And they show these to the extent that organizational policy allows. That policy obliges them to express a friendship conditioned on the other person's having organizational approval, conditioned on one's total acceptance of its teachings and policies, one's support of its program of activity. Love of God and Christ, respect for the Scriptures, love of people, high moral standards, conscientiousness, none of these will assure the continuation of the expressions of love toward a person if he or she does not meet the organizational conditions just stated. There is a saying that any organization is nothing more than the lengthened shadow of a man or men who are at its head and control it. Does the Watchtower organization itself, then, act as a true friend in the way advocated in its own comments, quoted earlier? Or does it call for a loyalty from its members that it itself does not give? Does it show itself friendly and loyal only or primarily to those who can give it support, time, money, effort, and submission to its views and policies, giving it that which increases its size and strength and influence? Does it show itself warm to and speak in praise of those who do this in large measure, giving much, but cool to those who do it in lesser measure, subtly implying that it expected more from them? Does it love those who are moved to speak out in telling the truth to it in a corrective manner? Or does it view itself as above receiving correction from anyone but itself or God, angrily labeling those who express reproof as enemies, not only of itself, but enemies of God? Does it avoid being overly inquisitive, personal, or possessive toward members? Or does it rather assume the right to insert itself in virtually every aspect of their life, advancing its own dogmatic opinions as to how they should conduct a large portion of their personal affairs, how they should spend their time, what they should read, what employment is acceptable, what attitude they should take as to their children's education, to what extent members should interest themselves in persons outside the organization's own area of control, how far they should go in extending charity to such ones, and in a host of other ways show itself as overly personal and possessive? Does it merely offer its opinions as simply opinions? Or does it instead persistently advance these opinions, while simultaneously implying that failure to accept them demonstrates a lack of respect? Would one not find that kind of friendship on a personal, individual level something oppressive? Yet, whereas many would not tolerate this imposition of standards from an individual, they will accept it from a system. The individual witness member's knowledge of the organization's standpoint cannot but color the quality of his own friendship with any fellow member. The oppressive spirit expressed by the organization cannot help but severely limit the extent and strength of that relationship, creating a climate in which the unselfish, courageous, and self-sacrificing loyalty of genuine friendship is at risk. Generally, when one who has spent much of his or her life in the witness organization comes to the conclusion that its claims of exclusively having God's favor are not solidly based, this results in a sense of distress, a period of crisis marked by an intense struggle between the appeal for organizational loyalty and the voice of conscience. At such a time, one normally turns to close friends for help or counsel or added strength. One of the great blessings of true friendship is precisely that sense of freedom to open up on things of deep concern, knowing that while the friend may not agree, he or she will listen and give honest consideration to one's reasons and especially one's motivation. In the, quote, spiritual paradise, however, any frank expression of a different viewpoint, no matter how conscientious, almost automatically brings a cloud of suspicion. Winds of rumors begin blowing. The test of whether one's friends are fair-weather friends or not, of how loyal they will prove themselves regardless of the trialsome or difficult conditions, or the heart-searching circumstances that may develop, to use the Watchtower's expressions, now begins. Though not always, the results are usually disillusioning. Whether the observation one makes is true or not is rarely given consideration, for the one spoken to may not even take the time or thought necessary to consider whether there is validity in it. The lengthened shadow of the organizational leadership looms over the friendship and almost automatically has a chilling effect. All too often, when one goes through a crisis situation that causes loss of organizational favor, the reaction is, using the words the Watchtower employs of false friends, don't get involved. Some have said, I don't know the details and I prefer not to know. Others, learning of adverse action by a judicial committee, have said, I don't know the circumstances, but the individual must have been in the wrong or the organization would not have taken the action it did. Thus, the person is presumed guilty of wrong without any hearing of the evidence. I know personally of a number of long-term friendships where both parties saw the same fallacies and organizational wrongs and felt free to discuss them in candid conversation. When one of the parties came under organizational scrutiny, however, the other, perhaps with a degree of embarrassment and with assurances that my respect for you hasn't changed and you'll still be my friend, nonetheless, in effect, said that circumstances made it necessary to cease communication and association. As the Watchtower's quotation of the elderly woman's comment puts it, they love but at a distance, in contrast to the friend sticking closer than a brother in time of crisis. The footnote references Proverbs 18:24. This concern for organizational acceptance and a corresponding lack of concern for truth are by no means unique with Jehovah's Witnesses. It is also true of other religious organizations. A few years ago, while I was visiting in California, some friends took me to see Ambassador College. It is the major educational center of the Worldwide Church of God, originally founded by the now deceased Herbert W. Armstrong, and occupies a relationship comparable to that of Gilead School with the Watchtower Society. While in the large cafeteria-style dining room, I could not help but note the similarity between the people and surroundings to those found in the dining room of one of the Watchtower institutions, such as the Brooklyn Bethel. The surroundings were pleasant. Everything was scrupulously clean. The people there, young people of different racial backgrounds, were all neatly dressed, many carrying briefcases, and their faces reflected a sense of dedication. The initial impression could only be that of peaceful unity, of earnestness in making known what those there understood to be God's purpose. More recently, I read a letter published in a periodical called Ambassador Review. It was written by a former member of the Worldwide Church of God who had been a part of the staff of Ambassador College. In 1972, he began experiencing serious doubts about the validity of the religion's claims, but, as he says, he felt this was God's one true church, and that God would take care of the situation. And if this indeed was the only true church, where else was he to go? He adds that many in the church said we shouldn't even open a piece of literature written by a dissident. However, he finally withdrew from this organization in 1974, and among the conclusions he had by then reached were these. Quote, before an individual becomes a member of the Worldwide Church of God, he is encouraged to prove all things, hold fast that which is true. The ministry tells him, don't believe what we say, check it out. If we teach contrary to God's word, do not follow us. Unfortunately, the opposite process begins once one is in the Worldwide Church of God. The member is told that Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong is closer to God and has more of his Holy Spirit than anyone else, which is the reason he is the leader of the church. Or, since Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong is the leader of God's church, he must be closer to God and have more of his Holy Spirit than anyone else. This type of circular reasoning is taught to the members and is applied to a lesser degree to successive layers of officials on down the line. By the time you get to the lowly lay member, his opinion is worthless when compared with the hundreds of those who must be closer to God since they have higher positions, or who have higher positions since they are closer to God. There is so much here that is familiar. The same initial process stressing personal conviction when attracting persons, thereafter followed by the same process of subordinating them to an authority structure once they are inside. For Jehovah's Witnesses, no persons are viewed as in a closer relationship to Jehovah God and Christ than those forming the governing body. They believe that Holy Spirit operates in a special way toward these men. Those of what the Watchtower has referred to as the rank and file feel that to question the direction of this body is to question God's direction of his people. The former Worldwide Church of God member goes on to say, quote, In this way, the member is stripped of any confidence in himself or God's Spirit in him. He places Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong and the rest of the ministry in the position of defining what he must believe, in the place of Jesus Christ and the Bible. The ministry carefully shows the lay members how to prove the beliefs of the Worldwide Church of God from the Bible. The member thinks his belief is firmly grounded in the Bible, but for him to prove it, he must rely heavily on the proof texts and the explanations he has been given. I don't necessarily mean all these beliefs or explanations are incorrect, but the member is being groomed into a spiritually dependent person, and his primary dependency isn't on Christ or the Holy Spirit, but on Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong and the ministry of the Worldwide Church of God. It doesn't take a spiritually strong person to merely accept exactly what the church teaches and to obey it strictly, but it does require strength of character and spirit to question, research, prove, and then abide your convictions, regardless of what the church or anyone else says. The footnote reads, from a 1976 letter by Bob Geringer to Charles Hunting. The remarkable parallel between the conditions he describes in this religion and those prevailing among Jehovah's Witnesses should be obvious to any witness. One need but substitute governing body and the organization in place of references to Mr. Armstrong or the church ministry, and the description fits precisely. All the religious organizations obviously endeavor to instill loyalty in their membership, encourage submission to the direction of the leadership. What attaches an added degree of reprehensibility is when there is such a sharp contrast between the reality and the extreme claims an organization makes for itself. The constant self-praise and self-commendation accompanied by an equally constant deprecation of all others and of their religious record. The climate of fear thus found in the Watchtower's spiritual paradise and its effect on freeness of speech is strikingly like that found in countries controlled by a totalitarian system, where one must be constantly on guard due to an informer system. In numerous cases, the person's own mate or family members or relatives have threatened to go to the elders simply because the individual conscientiously questions the biblical support for a certain teaching, or because of quietly discontinuing attendance at organizational meetings. At times, it is the carrying out of this threat by family members that leads to judicial hearings. The result is a circumstance like one long ago that caused Jehovah's prophet to give this warning. Quote, "Do not put your faith in a companion. Do not put your trust in a confidential friend. From her who is lying in your bosom, guard the openings of your mouth. For a son is despising a father. A daughter is rising up against her mother. A daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his household." Footnote references Micah 7, 5, and 6. The friendship of David and Jonathan is often cited in Watchtower literature as an example of the loyal unity that should be found in God's congregation. See, for example, the Watchtower of May 15, 1985, page 9, and January 1, 1989, page 28. Jonathan's loyalty to David, however, is in stark contrast to that generally found within the witness organization. David was suddenly placed in a position of complete disfavor with what constituted the national organizational structure of Israel, topped by its visible, theocratically appointed head, King Saul. He was viewed as an enemy by such anointed organizational head, was forced to live like a disfellowshipped or excommunicated person. The footnote references 1 Samuel 19, 11 and 12, and 20 and 1, and 22, 1 and 2. David even hid out for a time at Gath among the pagan Philistines, the people who ultimately caused the death of Saul, and he also placed his parents in the protective care of the king of Moab. The footnote references 1 Samuel 21, 10, and 22, 3 and 4. If Saul's son Jonathan had lived according to the watchtower concept of an overriding duty to uphold and support all organizational action and policy, he would have summarily ceased all association with David. Very much to the contrary, though knowing that the highest authority of the national organization viewed the man as an enemy, he continued to meet with David and act on his behalf, even speaking in defense of this condemned, exiled man before the anointed, theocratically appointed organizational authority. He did so because he believed that David was blessed of Jehovah, despite the organizational rejection he was experiencing. The footnote references 1 Samuel 20:16. Jonathan's loyalty was not predicated upon nor controlled by organizational acceptance and approval. It had a far higher basis. Though perhaps rare, there are persons among Jehovah's Witnesses who have courageously demonstrated that kind of friendship, despite the outcome they knew might lie ahead. Fruitage of joy. In listing the fruits of the Spirit, the apostle places joy after love. The footnote references Galatians 5:22. As with the other aspects of the claimed spiritual paradise, the genuineness of this fruitage presents a contrast between appearance and reality. During the nearly 60 years of my life spent in association with Jehovah's Witnesses, I had many enjoyable experiences, and I retained some pleasant memories. Though I am definitely happier now, I was not unhappy then. Yet I know that what degree of happiness I did have was always limited and restricted by a sense of unremitting pressure. The problem was not with internal pressure resulting from heart motivation, for that led to spontaneous acts that brought me much happiness. The problem was with external pressure that seemed to lay claim to all my time and all that I was, that squeezed out truly spontaneous acts and use of time. During the 20 years I spent as a missionary, I felt warm affection for the people where I served, many of them of humble circumstances, and I still hold such feeling. I enjoyed living among them in their lands. Looking back, I realize now that most of the happiness I had was due to people as persons, rather than something directly attributable to the religion itself. We have already seen in previous chapters how responsible organizational representatives have themselves voiced the sense of pressure felt by most witnesses, a pressure sustained by the steady flow of exhortation to greater effort through the communications received from the Brooklyn headquarters and its traveling representatives. That constant pressure and distress it produces does not contribute to emotional health or true happiness, nor does it lead to genuine spiritual growth and the joy this produces. It contributes to a routine of activity that often brings little sense of accomplishment, and which is largely sustained by the hovering sense of guilt the organizational pressure creates. Much of the witnesses' joy is said to be because they partake of a rich banquet of spiritual food. Though regularly told that they are spiritually the best-fed people on earth, the fact is that when they feel safe to do so, witnesses frequently acknowledge a sense of monotony, tiring sameness in their meetings, even in their large assemblies, being annual repetitions of what has been said again and again in previous assemblies. Their service meetings manifest many of the markings of sale meetings, with emphasis on techniques and constant exhortations to greater activity and productivity. The assembly programs are extraordinarily predictable from year to year. All talks of any length, either given locally or at assemblies, must conform scrupulously to outlines the organization itself supplies. Listening, one in reality hears the organization, not the person speaking. Often, if asked what they learned at a meeting or at an assembly program, witnesses are hard put to recall anything of substance to give as a reply. Rarely do they come away with anything that stays in their mind as something genuinely strengthening to faith, or that can contribute toward an improvement in their service to God and their efforts at Christian living. The youth among Jehovah's Witnesses particularly express their sense of weariness in these meetings, finding much that is monotonous. The ratio of children of Jehovah's Witnesses who, upon reaching the age of independence, leave the organization has always been notably high. A letter sent to the headquarters by one longtime elder and city overseer made these comments about both home instruction and congregational instruction of young people. Quote, "The teaching at home has been, in most cases, superficial. Depth is lacking. Relevancy is absent. Some parents have built superlative young people out of fire-resistant material. Others raised themselves, and although exposed to the truth, it never had great meaning for them. Thus, they marry, get a job, start a family, and disappear into the woodwork. They're present, but always on the perimeter. For example, I have conducted sessions with young men in the congregation relating to improvement of speaking and reading. It also addresses itself to teaching and learning the Bible. It's not organized, it's informal. But all the participants beg for more such sessions. They love to come, and soon others are coming with them. This attitude is completely opposite to the congregation meetings. Why? They are personally involved. Their opinions are valued. Their progress is noted, and they work hard to qualify for assignments. I know this can't be done everywhere. We do not have the personnel. But the concept is right, I feel, because it works." The footnote reads, quoted from a letter sent by Robert McKee, dated March 1st, 1978. The elder himself says that the young men's loving to come was completely opposite to the congregation meetings, and that personal involvement and appreciation of their opinions were a significant part of the difference. What he did was on his own initiative, neither supported by the Society's own program nor encouraged by the Society. In reality, if others, even elders, had begun following his example, they would most certainly have been warned not to offer an alternative to the organization's own program. That remains the case today. The footnote reads, McKee was not only city overseer for Tampa, Florida, but was also the person who recorded the gospel accounts for the Watchtower's Bible tapes. I am quite certain that this granted him special consideration. It is a known fact that most witnesses read only the scheduled material in the assigned book or magazine, if they even read that beforehand, and rarely take the time to look up or meditate on any scriptures cited. In virtually every article or in any scriptural discussion, the organization, its policies, goals, its claimed importance are regularly interwoven into the discussion, and these color the understanding of the scriptures cited, overshadow or even displace the sense of the context. Members are not encouraged to use their minds as individual mature Christians, but are instead reminded constantly of the need to conform, to avoid anything resembling independent thinking, to accept what the faithful slave serves them as if coming from God. It never seems to occur to them that for genuinely personal conviction, there must be independent thinking, for we each must arrive at conclusions as individuals with the free exercise of conscience and of our mental powers. Similar to the situation described in the text from Isaiah, the nourishment of the spiritual banquet proves to be more illusion than reality, and spiritual hunger remains. It is a sad fact that when an individual endeavors to increase his or her spiritual knowledge and growth by personal effort beyond the routinized program set out, more often than not, this brings him or her into conflict with the organization. Superior cleanness and unity. Of course, we shouldn't dare include ourselves in the same class as those who write their own testimonials. All they are doing, of course, is to measure themselves by their own standards or by comparisons within their own circle, and that doesn't make for accurate estimation. 2 Corinthians 10:12, Phillips Modern English. The morality level found among Jehovah's Witnesses is unquestionably much higher than in the world as a whole. I believe that on the basis of my own experience among them over many decades. The question is whether the moral level is so exceptionally high and the incidence of misdeeds so remarkably low as to fit the concept of a spiritual paradise, one without equal anywhere else. What is said here, then, represents no attempt whatsoever to downgrade or minimize the good record of witnesses for law-keeping or morality when contrasted with people in general, nor is it a case of damning with faint praise. The purpose is solely to consider whether that record is so notably superior as to justify the Watchtower organization's own depiction of itself as a virtual island of morality, distinctive and superior to all other religions. The standards of judging that the organization uses in such a recommendation of itself deserve examination. An illusionary picture can be created by a very selective use of experiences or expressions. Out of 100 experiences, 95 might be negative, but if only the 5 positive ones are made known, it is possible to create a very favorable impression. It is also a false impression. The reverse is likewise true, where a few negative factors are publicized and the more numerous favorable ones are suppressed, thus creating an equally false impression. It would be wrong to assess the witness organization by either such method. It would also be wrong for the witness organization to assess other religions on the basis of such methods. What does the evidence show? It would be extremely difficult to find any favorable statement about any religion other than their own in the publications of the Watchtower Society, at least from the 1920s forward. By contrast, anything unfavorable about another belief system, as, for example, acts of immorality, dishonesty, or of other wrongdoing, becomes material worthy of consideration for inclusion in their publications. The more unfavorable it is, the more likely it's being included. Whether the incident or circumstance or attitude is actually representative of the religious affiliation as a whole does not seem to be of concern. This critical standard is applied to all other religions. A very different standard, one virtually opposite, is applied to their own. Only on rare occasions does one read an admission of specific wrongdoing by members within the witness organization. One example appeared in the Watchtower of March 15, 1988, page 17, regarding an elder who committed adultery with a married witness woman. The woman's non-witness husband went to the Kingdom Hall and fired a shotgun at the man and his wife. But it may be noted that long before it appeared in the Watchtower magazine, this matter had already received publicity in the largest circulation newspaper of New York City, and hence was already out in the open. It is hardly an example of openness or candor or humility on the part of an organization to acknowledge something that is already widely known. The footnote reads, in another reported case in New York in 1987, a young woman who broke off her romantic relationship with a 27-year-old man later received a package from him containing what looked like a pen, but which concealed a spring-out blade that cut her hand when she opened the package. A month later, she received another package, which she began to open and then realized who it was from. Before she could push it away, it exploded, causing cuts and breaking her thumb while blowing her 18-month-old niece across the room. The 27-year-old sender, charged with sending an explosive device by mail, was described by his employer as, quote, a deeply religious Jehovah's Witness. The Chicago Tribune, November 15, 1990, reported a 16-year-old's first shooting his father to death in cold blood and then waiting for his mother to return home and murdering her. Friends of the family are quoted as describing them as Jehovah's Witnesses who did everything together. A former neighbor described the boy as a little angel who had been doing door-to-door work with his parents since he was a young boy. Unlike the other case, these and similar witness crimes are not reported in any Watchtower publication. Not that anyone would rightly expect that an organization should air to the world each and every case of the trespasses and wrong acts of its individual members, for that could serve no valid purpose and would be both unkind and harmful. What is wrong is to create an impression of great moral superiority by widely publicizing the failings of those of other beliefs, making it appear that these are common and typical of the membership as a whole, while almost totally suppressing any admission of similar failings on a similar scale within one's own belief system. But are such failings evident on a similar scale within Jehovah's Witnesses? At the Brooklyn headquarters, as I know personally from having worked there, entire file cabinets in the service department are filled with the records of cases of wrongdoing, some minor, many of them major, within the witness membership. The entire gamut of wrongdoing is covered, from fornication, adultery, homosexuality, incest and sexual molestation of children, to fraud, theft, wife-beating, and murder. Comparable records to those in the U.S. may be found in the branch offices of the organization throughout the world. In another rare expression, the Watchtower of January 1st, 1986, page 13, acknowledged that the spiritual paradise offered no real guarantee of protection from immorality. It said, quote, "Shocking as it is, even some who have been prominent in Jehovah's organization have succumbed to immoral practices, including homosexuality, life-swapping, and child molesting." It is to be noted also that during the past year, 36,638 individuals had to be disfellowshipped from the Christian congregation, the greater number of them for practicing immorality. As the statement quoted acknowledges, this wrongdoing is not limited to any one segment, but reaches into all levels. Individuals in positions of authority at the international headquarters or in branch organizations are by no means exempt, and I can recall cases of branch representatives engaging in theft, stealing from the branch funds, having a record of alcoholism, engaging in adulterous sexual relations, in one case with a prostitute, in another with the wife of a missionary living at the branch office, and other moral failures. As an example of giving a misleading appearance, the October 1st, 1983 Watchtower, page 7, refers to a Quebec journalist who wrote favorably of a witness convention in Montreal. It quotes him as saying, "If they were the only people in the world, we would not at night have to bolt our doors shut and put on the burglar alarm." He may think so. He does not know that at the international headquarters at Brooklyn, where the largest concentration of witnesses on earth is to be found, it became necessary decades ago to install locks on all doors to living quarters, and I can never recall a period of any length during my 15 years there when there was not at least one witness thief active within the Bethel family. Periodic warnings were necessary from the head of the table as to leaving valuables unattended or unsecured. While the thievery or alcoholism or similar wrongs were limited to a relative few, it needs to be remembered that this was in a community of persons then numbering under 1,900, hence like a fairly small town, but with a specialized population from which one might expect a far smaller incidence of wrongdoing than in a small town. The Watchtower publications consistently claim that regular activity and door-to-door field service constitutes a strong protection against spiritual weakness and wrongdoing. Yet most of those just described in branch offices and in the international headquarters were active in such work. The evidence to show that the incidence of wrongdoing is to any measurable degree reduced by such factors as field service activity or meeting attendance is lacking. Nor is there anything to show that cases of wrongdoing among those in full-time service are any less than among those not in such service. In a letter to the Brooklyn headquarters, a witness of over 30 years of association wrote, quote, "I am afraid my attempt to convey what is happening here is bound to sound overstated, because the reality of the situation is pretty grim. I think of the 4 persons in the congregation who have been suicidal, two of them pioneers. I think of the serious marriage problems in the congregation, at least half a dozen pioneers included. These problems appear to be directly related to the congregational problems, not isolated events. I remember talking to a sister who had been auxiliary pioneering many months while she was planning to leave the truth next month so I can leave my husband, to quote her. She had asked me to drive her to a certain city to see an elder there who was a trained counselor, but she canceled the appointment. When I later found that she had done something drastically foolhardy and asked her why she hadn't sought help before that happened, she replied, "I had to get my time in first." Her attitude is not unique here. The footnote reads, letter dated July 10th, 1985, writer's name withheld for reasons of privacy. I think that if any witness were to pause and compare the claims made with the reality to be seen in virtually any area, would be compelled to acknowledge that the number of cases of marital unfaithfulness, broken marriages, and accompanying divorce, of relatively unstable family relationships, of emotionally disturbed children, juvenile delinquency and drug problems, and similar failures are by no means rare, that they are actually quite frequent. I know of men who became elders and, as a result of being assigned to participate in judicial hearings, were shocked to realize the amount of wrongdoing and sometimes the extreme kinds of wrongdoing taking place within the organization. While praise of the superiority of Jehovah's Witnesses as employees is regularly claimed, and quotations of favorable expressions made by employers frequently appear in the organization's magazine, I have personally had businessmen after businessmen among Jehovah's Witnesses tell me that often their witness employees gave them considerably more difficulty than those classed as worldly employees. Though there was generally scrupulous avoidance of committing major wrongs, petty dishonesty, misuse of time, lack of cooperation, substandard quality of work, and other failures to act in the best interests of the business were evident to a degree that simply did not accord with the organizational boasts made. Many religious affiliations could benefit from the example of Jehovah's Witnesses in the area of racial integration, in their de-emphasizing of class distinctions, their comparatively strong sense of commitment and obligation toward anyone, though otherwise a complete stranger to them, who is a member in good standing in the organization. Perhaps some of the most appealing and dramatic features in their history are those occasions when they have been faced with crisis situations in times of intense persecution or natural disasters or war, when many of them have shown a willingness to risk their own safety, possessions, or even their own lives in the interests, in one way or another, of fellow members. The accounts of the experiences of witnesses during the Nazi regime in Germany, during the Devalue premiership of Quebec, or during the periods of mob violence in the United States in the 1940s make absorbing reading. The sincerity of those who demonstrated a courageous and selfless concern for others rightly goes unquestioned, and I find their example both encouraging and laudable. Having personally experienced a measure of what it means to live through years of physical difficulty, mob violence, or the dangers of imprisonment due to engaging in meetings and other activity when these have been banned by an oppressive government, I do not underestimate the courage this often requires, the determination to hold firm to certain standards. As a sharer in such trials, I do not feel that it shows any disrespect to consider also whether these quite dramatic actions necessarily authenticate the claims of an unequaled spiritual unity, or can be viewed as distinguishing the organization thereby supported as containing Earth's only genuine Christians. Looking at matters from a broad perspective, there is no question in my mind that whatever I myself did in such circumstances was not at all something unique to Jehovah's Witnesses, but rather had undoubtedly been duplicated or excelled by people of other faiths in quite comparable circumstances, whether the dangers they faced arose from persecution or were instead due to seeking to help people by going into areas fraught with peril because of violence, or savagery, or disease, or religious animosity or hatred. Nor do I feel it shows any lack of appreciation for such examples of self-sacrifice to recognize that what is done in times of crisis is not always indicative of the norm prevailing in more ordinary times, in the day-to-day living that composes most of human life in any society. I am satisfied that the expressions of giving, of self-sacrifice, of compassion, fellow feeling, brotherly attachment, and strong friendship shown in such day-to-day ordinariness, when constant and untiring, in the final analysis are often of greater significance than similar expressions made in the heat of more dramatic circumstances. I believe the evidence demonstrates the rightness of that view. The footnote reads, with regard even to cults such as that of the Moonies, Steve Hassan says in his book, quote, relationships are usually superficial within these groups because sharing of deep personal feelings, especially negative ones, is highly discouraged. This feature of cult life prevails even though a member may feel he is closer to his comrades than he has ever been to anyone else before. Indeed, when cult members go through hardship or persecution, they do feel a depth of camaraderie and shared martyrdom that is exceptional. But because the only real allegiance is to the leader, a closer look shows that such ties are actually shallow and sometimes just private fantasy. Page 82. I would make one final reference to the branch memorandum quoted earlier. It is from Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, and the one with the largest number of witnesses, over 100,000 at the time of the memorandum's writing. The memorandum contains many favorable statements about Nigerian witnesses, their enduring trials, their efforts to maintain neutrality during the Biafran War, the difficulties faced by children due to refusal to salute the flag. It stresses the firmness of the witnesses in holding to the organization's position on these issues, a firmness commented on by some onlookers. The memorandum also responded to an inquiry as to manifestation of the fruitage of God's Spirit in the normal affairs of daily life, and here again, various favorable experiences were related. All of this was what one might expect, was customary to such reports. What differed was the frankness expressed in acknowledging the negative side of matters. It showed that the unity, racial and otherwise, supposedly so exclusively and distinctively the possession of Jehovah's Witnesses, is considerably less than ideal. The memorandum states, quote, sometimes situations develop in congregations where there are divisions along tribal or family lines, showing that in some cases fleshly connections are stronger than spiritual ones. Then there are those brothers in many congregations who do not really associate with other members of the congregation. They come to the meetings with the opening song and leave with the closing song. Very little communication exists. Some have practically no social contact with other brothers or only with a select few. There are, too, those who harbor animosities and never speak to certain brothers at any time. Unbrotherly attitudes even show up among elders. Elders' meetings have been known to be forums for bickering and recriminations. Some have violent arguments in which they throw uncomplimentary names at each other. Sometimes tribal or racial considerations influence the acceptance or rejection of suggestions. Disconcertingly, often brothers show unbrotherly attitudes in business and employee-employer relationships. Employed brothers sometimes exploit and rob brothers who employ them, and some witness employers treat their employees harshly and dishonorably, without even consideration for their need to attend meetings and engage in field service. Some have come to grief and relationships destroyed over business dealings, either through misunderstandings or because of outright dishonesty. Sometimes brothers prosecute accusations against brothers as they would through lawyers in worldly courts, and a few do go to worldly courts. Even in the case of repentant sinners, elders often have a tendency to be unmerciful. The footnote references page 20 and 21 of the Nigerian Memorandum. There is no intent here to imply that these conditions are typical of all Nigerian witnesses. I visited Nigeria in 1979 and met a number of fine persons among the witnesses there. At the same time, in its memorandum, the branch had been requested to supply information not based on rare or isolated incidents, but dealing with genuine problems affecting witnesses in their country. That is the only reason I include this quotation. Not only the use of many, often, and similar expressions, but the whole tenor of the report makes clear that the picture of a unique spiritual paradise, superlatively abundant in the fruitage of God's Spirit, is hardly in harmony with the facts. It shows witnesses to be quite like people to be found in other religious denominations where similar problems occur. The conditions reported by the Nigerian branch are neither surprising nor unusual. If not the same conditions, then comparable ones can be found in congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses in most countries of the world. What is unusual is the forthrightness of the branch personnel in acknowledging the existence and extent of the problems. Unusual because organizational representatives as a whole are hesitant to present matters to the headquarters that are not in accord with the concept of a spiritual paradise state. In the years that I spent at the international headquarters, the vast majority of communications presented only the bright side of matters, items such as are published in Watchtower literature. When reports of a more candid nature came to the governing body or one of its committees, they rarely were considered at length. I think it can be truthfully said that perceptive information pointing out any lack of genuine spirituality and its root causes created a certain sense of discomfort among the members, as though they would prefer not to hear them. They seemed to find them disturbing, unsettling, not conforming to the published claims of a worldwide community that enjoys superlative spiritual health and unequaled brotherly unity, a community in which the only true Christians on earth are to be found. The more frank the report, the more insight shown as to the underlying nature of the problems, the shorter the time the governing body members seemed willing to spend in discussing it. Their quickness in moving on to other matters or to portions of the report more in conformity with the published picture brought to mind the description of Israel that God spoke through his prophet Isaiah. Quote, "They have said to the ones seeing, 'You must not see,' and to the ones having visions, 'You must not envision any straightforward things. Speak to us smooth things,' or pleasant things, NIV. Envision deceptive things, or seductive things, NEB. The footnote references Isaiah 30, verse 10. I cannot feel that love of truth, and particularly concern for people and their interests, can allow for such an ivory tower frame of mind. There is, then, no intention whatsoever of portraying Jehovah's Witnesses as an essentially immoral community. They are not. I believe that among Jehovah's Witnesses as a whole, the majority are decent people of good morality. Nor should anyone expect perfection within any community of people. But the evidence needed to support claims of distinctive moral superiority over all other religious communities so that there is cause for boasting is actually lacking. No organizational census covering these areas is ever taken, and therefore no statistics are available. On the basis of nearly 60 years of association and of acquaintance with members in places throughout the world, I personally have no question that if such statistics were available, they would show that there is no great difference in the percentage of failed marriages, divorce, youthful wrongdoing, or sinful conduct of whatever kind between the Watchtower organization membership and that of many other religious affiliations. In a few cases, particularly among certain religions that give especially great emphasis to strong family relationships, the difference might in fact prove unfavorable to the witnesses. What evidence there is certainly provides no basis for the public declaration of being far purer than all others. The "I thank you, God, that I am not as other men are" syndrome of the Pharisees in Jesus' parable. The probable response by the organization to this would be that Jehovah's Witnesses are superior and that they take action against wrongdoers and disfellowship those they find to be unrepentant, thus maintaining a clean organization. No one can fail to appreciate a concern to act where wrongdoing is manifest. As has been seen in an earlier chapter, however, their record in disfellowshipping people is considerably more notable than their record in helping wrongdoers to correct and be restored, which is the mission of a true shepherd of the sheep. The footnote reads, see chapters 10 and 11. Any claim of superiority and cleanness over other religious communities needs to rest more on this latter factor, and also on a demonstrated ability to produce an environment that encourages and helps people through spiritual strength to avoid wrongdoing, so that the incidence of such is exceptionally low. Mere punishment of wrongdoing does not of itself make any organization clean or superior in its cleanness to other organizations. A government might consistently exile all those disagreeing with its decisions and rule, but that would not prove that the country was free of dissidents or discontent, not if the exiling continued to go on year after year. Nor would the practice of executing all criminals mean that a country was free of crime and superior to all other countries in enjoying a crime-free environment, particularly not if the crimes and subsequent executions continued to occur at essentially the same rate as always. The statement sometimes made that there are no Jehovah's Witnesses found in prisons for reasons other than conscience can also be misleading. If a witness found guilty by a court for committing a crime is pronounced disfellowshipped before or upon being committed to prison, this does not change the fact that he was a witness at the time of committing the crime. In actuality, there is never a time when the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses can rightfully boast of being uniquely clean, for there is never any point in time in which there are not within it thousands of persons who, right at that time, are engaging in serious wrongdoing. At this writing, there are a percentage of persons within the organization engaging in marital infidelity, fornication, drunkenness, acts of greed and dishonesty, and other forms of wrongdoing already contained in the extensive organizational files set aside for that purpose. There are individuals among these, of course, who will, in time, without any judicial hearing, voluntarily turn around from such a course and lead exemplary lives. At the same time, others have been engaging in such conduct over a period of many years. Some will not be discovered for more years to come, if at all. The footnote reads, as only one example, in 1985, the September 23rd issue of the Alberta Report from Canada carried an article about the conviction of an attorney who was, quote, jailed for stealing more than $200,000 from his clients between 1973 and 1984, more than half of it from fellow Jehovah's Witnesses at the church where he was an elder. Many of the witness victims over the 10-year period were Ukrainian and unable to read or write English, and they put their complete trust in the witness elder. The victims included one elderly woman who had entrusted to the man an entire insurance settlement for a car accident that left her a paraplegic. As a result of the elder's dishonesty, she had received less than half of it. This attorney was a featured speaker at one of the annual witness doctor-lawyer gatherings. This continues to be the case despite the thousands disfellowshipped annually. Nor is there anything to show that the percentage of wrongdoers is less today than it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. The footnote reads, the report made in the 1986 Watchtower of 36,000 disfellowshipped is no anomaly. Each year sees a similar figure. 1988, for example, saw another 40,000 disfellowshipped worldwide. Figure from the Milwaukee Journal of May 18, 1989, quoting Merton Campbell of the Watchtower headquarters staff. More crucial to the validation of a supposed moral superiority is the organization's inability to show that their percentage is any lower than the percentage to be found in many other religious communities. There are claims, of course, but there is no factual evidence to support the claims. Not that Jehovah's Witnesses are necessarily worse in this area than other religious fellowships and communities, or that they are not better than some religious fellowships. Their record simply does not substantiate the claims made for a unique superiority over every other religious affiliation. It does not in any way authenticate the picture drawn of a uniquely clean spiritual paradise. There is no question in my mind that the legalistic approach to Christianity, the multitudes of rules, and at the same time a frequent double standard, all contribute to an essentially blurred viewpoint of what Christian righteousness is. When the individual feels he or she is not under observation by organizational authority, these factors actually may produce a weakened resistance to wrongdoing. Those most affected. Not all are affected to the same degree by the factors that have been considered. There are, of course, as there were in Jesus' day, those who seem satisfied to follow some specific routine laid out for them, some of whom even take pleasure, and all too often pride, in the observance of traditional requirements and structured programs. Others are not particularly affected because they are simply not concerned about measuring up or gaining approval. Their very apathy shields them. It is a sad fact that those most affected by the persistent pressure to do more and more in organizationally directed activities are those persons among Jehovah's Witnesses who are the most sensitive and conscientious. For many of these, the argumentation that subtly implies guilt if one does not follow the organization's suggestions and recommendations in striving for increased service creates a constant concern that they are not doing enough, not measuring up. As if on a treadmill, there is never a real sense of accomplishment, but only the need to continue responding month by month to demands for performance, demands on their time that may not be openly stated, but which are presented in ways that imply a lack of faith or of zeal or of love if one does not respond. So while many witnesses just go along with the crowd and show little effect from the pressure, the real test of Christian religion is not what it does for those who appear free from need, but what it does for those who are, in a sense, frail, afflicted. God's rebuke to the spiritual leaders of the flock of Israel focused on this, saying, quote, "The sickened ones you have not strengthened, and the ailing one you have not healed, and the broken one you have not bandaged, and the dispersed one you have not brought back, and the lost one you have not sought to find. I myself shall feed my sheep, and I myself shall make them lie down, is the utterance of the Lord Jehovah. The lost one I shall search for, and the dispersed one I shall bring back, and the broken one I shall bandage, and the ailing one I shall strengthen. But the fat one and the strong one I shall annihilate. I shall feed that one with judgment. Here I am, I myself, and I shall certainly judge between a plump sheep and a lean sheep, for the reason that with flank and with shoulder you kept pushing, and with your horns you kept shoving all the sickened ones until you had scattered them to the outside." The footnote references Ezekiel 34, 4, 15, 16, 20, and 21. The same principles apply to Christian shepherds, and it is primarily their concern not for the sleek and strong sheep, NIV, but for the weak and injured and broken ones that tests the genuineness of their devotion to the flock. Of all those whom Christian shepherds are to treat with tenderness, certainly these should be the foremost. The footnote references Acts 20:29. To fail to recognize the pressures and strains that daily life in today's world already subjects such ones to is to be blind to their actual condition and needs. To push such ones by mental and emotional prods, to fail to provide them with needed emotional and spiritual rest and relief, can only bring the disapproval of the fine shepherd, Christ Jesus. These thoughts were expressed in a letter written in 1977 and directed to the Watchtower president, Franz. The writer said, quote, I have the feeling that especially sensitive persons that already have troubles in coping with a demanding, cruel world are loaded down by us with a lot of additional pressures and threats of destruction. The ones that really try to be faithful in all things and then realize they are only imperfect men and women that will never reach the combination of your strict goals for service, meeting, studies, behavior, etc., are in danger of breaking down under the combined pressure of requirements that are planted in them one by one through methods they are not even aware of, so that they are not able to weigh the order of priority among all those requirements and fall into depression in trying to fulfill them all. I found that I could only cope by reducing my exposure to your constant pressure. I attended only selected meetings and left certain meetings out because they made me depressed and upset. The writer of the letter was René Grootman, a native of Switzerland. I wrote here from his expressions since I believe the experiences he relates sum up and confirm much of what has been said in this entire chapter. As a witness, René had spent time in prison for refusing to serve in the Swiss army. He felt a desire to help those mentally ill, trained as a male nurse, and obtained work at a psychiatric hospital in Zurich. He resigned after a year or so due to the issue of having to serve patients food that contained blood plasma. He thus demonstrated his loyal adherence to the witness stands regarding the military and blood. In his letter to the Watchtower president, he said his reason for writing was, quote, to give you feedback on how your teachings and methods came across to me during the last 22 years of my being a Jehovah's Witness. It is my hope that this contribution may shed some light on many depressions and suicides among very conscientious brothers and sisters. He then gave details of 4 suicides among Jehovah's Witnesses that he personally knew of, and other cases of witnesses needing psychiatric care. The footnote reads, this is not something exceptional. I know similarly of several suicides among witnesses, including one occurring while I was at the international headquarters, in which a staff member jumped to his death from the top of one of the Society's factory buildings. Another in 1990, when a longtime member of the staff and a former member of the factory committee jumped to his death from the 3rd floor of one of the Society's residences. And I have correspondence listing an even greater number of suicides known to those writing. A tally of the number in other lands, particularly in the industrialized nations, would undoubtedly be considerable, though such matters are generally kept quiet and never published. René, however, had a much more personal case to relate. He related how he met and married his wife, Clarice. A zealous witness, she moved to the German-speaking part of Switzerland, lived with a family of witnesses, and in time started pioneer service while working half-days as a secretary to support herself. She often bicycled up to an hour to reach her assigned rural territory. Conscientious, she pushed herself to the point where she felt unable to continue, but was still encouraged to keep on by the circuit overseer to whom she spoke. Adding to her stress, she experienced problems with a witness, a married man who made passes at her. She reported the matter to the congregation overseer, but thereafter suffered the anger of the married man's wife for having done so. Before long, she gave way to an emotional breakdown. Her parents brought her home to the French-speaking part of Switzerland, but she was extremely depressed. The following morning, she went to the roof of a 4-storied building and jumped. She survived, but incurred multiple fractures on both legs and pelvis. The doctors had to amputate her right leg below the knee. When René met her, she had learned to walk with an artificial limb, but she had never been able to recover from the effects of what had happened. She felt that she had failed as a pioneer, and thus had failed God, and that her purpose in life was finished. She could not find forgiveness for herself for the things she had done. In his letter directed to the Watchtower organization, René wrote, quote, naturally, she later heard that nobody had forced her to go beyond her capacity in pioneering. Neither the persons that made these comments nor Clarice knew of the power of constantly repeated recommendations and counsel in a tiring program. But you know it, and God knows it. Renee found Clarice to be a lovely woman despite her handicap, normally a bright, outgoing person. They married, after 3 years, had a child, and Renee later took her to live in California in the hope that it would enable her to break with the past and overcome her feeling of guilt and depression. They associated with the witness congregation, but found little understanding or warmth of acceptance, and this disturbed Clarice. Renee recognized that his inability to give total support to all the organization's teachings and practices may have contributed to the local witnesses not giving much attention to them. The footnote reads, among other things, he viewed the practice of reporting time on report slips as undesirable, feeling that this had a coercive effect, something that even headquarters staff members such as Carl Adams and Robert Wallen basically recognized, as we have seen. He said he felt that to gain full acceptance, he would have had to, quote, submit to all teachings without thinking, to become a tape recorder that faithfully repeats everything that it is told. He adds, quote, I don't know how long I could have taken this without getting depressed myself. Clarice underwent psychiatric treatment for a while in Switzerland and then moved back to the United States, but with only minimal improvement in her feeling of depression. The sense of having failed religiously persisted. Renee offered to move back to Switzerland, but she expressed her preference to stay in California. One night, in October 1975, she left for an appointment at Kaiser Hospital. She did not return. The following morning, their car was located, parked near the Golden Gate Bridge. Her body was found floating in the waters of the bay by the bridge from which she had jumped. She was 34 years old. I realize that one cannot assign anyone's problems entirely to a single source. Nor did Renee do so, candidly recognizing not only his wife's somewhat fragile emotional makeup, but also his own imperfections and inabilities, wondering what more he might have done. But he also had no doubt there was an underlying factor that worked strongly against all efforts to bring relief to his wife. As he says in his letter to the organization, quote, I was reaching out with my arms and with my heart toward her, but I did not know how she perceived the world and the people around her. I was not in her shoes and artificial limb. I did not suffer her pain and distress. She was the type of person that could not protect themselves if they are programmed with overlapping and conflicting requirements. I would love to recommend our assembly to unstable and sensitive persons, but I cannot, out of the depth of my heart, recommend a religion whose pressure nearly killed me and that, I am convinced, was one of the biggest factors for the tragedy of my wife and others. When approached by Renee, the elders in the California congregation refused to conduct a funeral service based on their understanding of material about funerals for persons committing suicide in the Watchtower magazine of July 15, 1975, pages 447 and 448. They told him they had to protect the good reputation of the congregation. Renee could not see the rightness of such inflexible position. As he wrote, quote, we don't have to approve of her act. It was wrong. It was a sin. A funeral to me is not an approval of someone's lifestyle, but an act of support and love for the family left behind. I gave her the funeral service myself. I went to the funeral home with my father. I put a few roses on her body, caressed her for the last time, and then went on my knees and prayed, thanking God for the time we had together, praying that He would remember her in the resurrection. I prayed that He would help me to increase my love and awareness of the needs of people around me, to help me to raise our child to be a loving, responsible Christian. It may be pointed out that 2 years later, in the June 1, 1977 issue of the Watchtower, an article was published specifically allowing for an elder's conducting a funeral of one who had taken his or her life due to, quote, extreme despondency or mental derangement. This was not as a result of Rene Grootman's letter, for it never came to the governing body. Another incident brought discussion of the subject. In advocating a changed viewpoint during the discussion, I recall personally calling attention to David's funeral dirge after the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, in which David included both men in his eulogy, though the wounded Saul, seeking to avoid abuse at the hands of the Philistines, had taken his own life. The footnote references 2 Samuel 1:17 through 27. The change reflected in the above-mentioned watchtower is good, commendable. The elders in the California congregation, having that material, would undoubtedly have acted differently as a result of it. But I think that what needs to be noted is that their actions, their thinking, their feelings were, and probably still are, governed entirely by what the organization says, not by what human compassion and reason and scriptural principles and the example of God's own Son would move one to do. In making its change regarding funerals for suicides, the June 1, 1977 Watchtower article presented no scriptural argument as a reason for the change. It simply made the pronouncement that, quote, because of such fine purposes being served by a funeral discourse, it seems that a Christian minister could see his way clear to conduct a funeral in such cases. The organization had spoken, and now elders might do what perhaps their own hearts would have normally motivated them to do. If, however, the organization had not spoken, they would not feel free to act in such a compassionate way, would doubtless feel guilty if they did so, would certainly feel concerned about maintaining their eldership if they failed to conform fully to the organizational policy, and bereaved family members would continue to receive the same refusal Rene received after his wife's tragic death. I am forced to wonder what there is in all this that can in any way be described as spiritually paradisaical. Sometime after his wife's death, Rene and his small son returned to Switzerland. He had learned that while his wife was undergoing treatment in Switzerland, a man on duty as a frontier guard at Lake Geneva had seen her, fully clothed, walking out into the water and had gone after her, pulling her from the water. Coincidentally, the man's wife had known Clarice as a child. Rene visited the couple to thank them for what they had then done on his now-dead wife's behalf. During the conversation, he mentioned that Jehovah's Witnesses did not serve in the army, their reason being that they did not want to kill. The man's wife replied in a way that Rene has never forgotten. She said, quote, "Sometime we also kill with words." Whether or not the Watchtower president personally saw or read Rene's letter, I cannot say. I know that the letter did not come before the governing body, but that was normal. Whatever the case, the president did not answer it, as it was passed to one of the men on the correspondence desk for reply. I think the overall tone of that reply reflects remarkably that of the expressions made by the congregation elders to whom Rene appealed. The letter here is dated November 14, 1977. Dear Brother Grootman, your additional letter received last month and addressed to Brother Franz has been directed to the writing department. We note the circumstances leading up to the death of your wife. We regretted very much to learn of the emotional turmoil that led up to what appears to be her taking her own life. While you have drawn certain conclusions, Brother Grootman, as to what influenced her in this regard, we are sure you appreciate that it is very difficult to judge matters when it comes to human emotions and motivation. It is best to leave matters in Jehovah's merciful hands as we continue to look to Him for guidance, knowing that He will judge every situation with the proper balance of mercy and justice. You have attempted to place some of the blame upon Jehovah's organization, claiming that what is expected of Jehovah's people in the way of attending meetings and sharing in the service is too much. It leads to frustration and even emotional problems. But here again, you are attempting to judge Jehovah's people and the Christian congregation by what you have personally concluded. to what extent your own attitude and view on matters and the way you have handled matters with your wife have contributed to developments with your wife is a question which we would be unable to answer for you. As a frank observation, Brother Grootman, we would recommend that you recognize how Jehovah is leading and teaching his people as a whole, and the evident blessings that they have from Jehovah. You were inclined to find fault with the encouragement to share regularly in attending the meetings and in preaching the good news, feeling that what is said, at times, sets forth more than what is reasonable for God's people. The brothers here at headquarters, through the publications and otherwise, and the elders in the local congregations are merely endeavoring to discharge their responsibilities before Jehovah in providing encouragement and help to our brothers and sisters worldwide in remaining faithful to Jehovah and in fulfilling the commission to preach the good news of the kingdom in all the world as a witness. Each one individually has to decide how he or she can respond to the encouragement from the Scriptures according to his or her own circumstances and abilities. When you honestly appraise the encouragement given, there is no attempt to regiment or control the thinking of the brothers and sisters so as to make them robots. Your claim that the organization is attempting to brainwash or control the thoughts of the brothers and sisters is really unfounded. Unless, of course, you are pointing to what Jesus and the apostles did in training Christians and helping them to do, as the apostle Paul said at 1 Corinthians 1:10, to be fitly united in the same mind and in the same line of thought. May Jehovah bless your desire to serve him in accord with the prayer of the Apostle Paul in behalf of the Philippian Christians at Philippians 1:9-11. Your brothers in Jehovah's service, Watchtower Bible Tract Society of New York, Incorporated. This response is almost entirely devoted to justification of the organization's course and, bluntly stated, a put-down for the man who clearly wrote out of concern for a particular kind of persons within their organization and their welfare. The letter by the headquarters staff member contains at most one sentence that might be considered slightly comforting. As Renee mildly expresses it, quote, "Their reply was not very encouraging to me, left me rather on my own with my questioning and search for truth and love." He experienced some serious problems following his wife's death, but in time, through prayer and apart from the organization, overcame these and regained stability. I believe that the combination of evidence viewed on a worldwide basis reveals why it is reasonable to say that sensitive and emotionally fragile persons in particular are at risk in what is called the spiritual paradise. I cannot help but think again of the prophet's words, quote, "You hustle the weary with flank and shoulder, you butt them with your horns until you have driven them away." The footnote reads, the symbol EF indicates that the letter was written by Fred Rusk of the headquarters writing department. At the beginning of this consideration, I expressed a sense of sadness, and what has been discussed only heightens that sense. What appeared to offer such promise, what seemed to lead the way to something beautiful, has proven quite otherwise. The fine qualities to be found among many have been diverted from their normal outlet. There has been a depersonalizing and to some extent dehumanizing effect as a result of the elevation, almost the deification, of organizational authority. The sadness, as in the case of the former Roman Catholic theologian, results from instances of the damage done to persons by workings of an impersonal and unfree system. Not human interests, not the love of people that moved God to give his Son on their behalf, but the interests of an organization to sustain itself, to implant its essentially denominational views in more and more persons and extend and maintain its authority over them, has in effect slain the idea which gave it birth.